Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, whose determination and dignity shaped Tudor England during one of its most turbulent periods from 1485 to 1536. We'll softly explore her extraordinary path, from her childhood in the royal courts of Spain to her triumphant reign as Queen of England, and finally through her courageous stand against King Henry VIII, all while witnessing the birth of the English Reformation and the transformation of an entire nation. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video, as leave a gentle comment about which moment in Catherine's life moved you most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Tudor England lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Catherine, later known as Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, entered the world during a moment of profound transformation in Spanish history. In the early hours of December 16th, 1485, as darkness still wrapped itself around the Archbishop's palace in Alcalá de Henares, the cries of a newborn infant pierced the winter silence. This child, christened Catalina in the Spanish tradition, was the youngest daughter of two of the most powerful monarchs in Europe, King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. The palace where Catherine drew her first breath stood as a testament to the complex relationship between church and crown in 15th century Spain. Built by Archbishop Alonso Carrillo de Acuña in the mid-1400s, this grand residence served as both ecclesiastical headquarters and occasional royal dwelling. Its thick stone walls, Gothic arches, and spacious courtyards reflected the wealth and influence of the Spanish Church during this golden age of Catholic power. The palace overlooked the town of Alcalá de Henares, situated about 20 miles northeast of Madrid, in the heart of the Castilian plateau. On that December night, the palace bustled with activity. Midwives attended Queen Isabella as she labored to bring her fifth surviving child into the world. Servants hurried through corridors carrying hot water, clean linens, and medicinal herbs. Courtiers waited anxiously in antechambers, ready to spread news of the birth throughout the realm. And King Ferdinand paced, as expectant fathers have done throughout history, waiting to learn whether his wife had been safely delivered and whether the child was healthy. When Catherine's cries finally announced her arrival, there must have been a mixture of relief and perhaps mild disappointment. Relief, certainly, that Isabella had survived another dangerous childbirth. Maternal mortality was shockingly high in this era, even among queens with the best available medical care. But perhaps some disappointment that the child was another daughter rather than a second son. Spain needed male heirs to ensure stable succession, and while Ferdinand and Isabella already had a son, Prince Juan, the fragility of life in the 15th century meant that no dynasty could have too many potential heirs. Nevertheless, the birth of a healthy royal daughter was still a blessing and a cause for celebration. Just a few days after her birth, the infant Catalina was carried to the palace chapel for her baptism. She wore a christening gown of white brocade, lined with green velvet, trimmed with delicate gold lace, a garment that spoke of her parents' wealth and status. The ceremony was conducted by the Bishop of Palencia, one of the most senior prelates in Spain, surrounded by nobles, courtiers, and church officials who had gathered to witness this important sacrament. The baby was baptized with water from a silver font, anointed with holy oils, and formally welcomed into the Christian faith. Her godparents, carefully chosen from among the most distinguished families in Spain, made their solemn vows to ensure the child's Christian upbringing. Prayers were offered for her health, her future, and for the continued success of her parents' great enterprise, the completion of the Reconquista. The Spain into which Catherine was born was a land still echoing with the sounds of war. For nearly 8 centuries, Christian kingdoms in the north of the Iberian Peninsula had been slowly pushing southward, reclaiming territory from the Muslim Moors who had conquered most of Spain in the 8th century. This centuries-long struggle, known as the Reconquista, had shaped Spanish identity, culture, and politics. By the time of Catherine's birth, only one Moorish kingdom remained, Granada in the south. Catherine's parents, Ferdinand and Isabella, had united the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon through their marriage in 1469. Isabella had inherited Castile from her brother in 1474, and Ferdinand had become King of Aragon upon his father's death in 1479. Their marriage created what would eventually become the unified nation of Spain, though at the time of Catherine's birth, Castile and Aragon remained technically separate kingdoms with their own laws, customs, and institutions. The union of Ferdinand and Isabella was both a love match and a political masterstroke. But Isabella was a formidable woman in her own right, intelligent, pious, politically astute, and possessed of an iron will. She had fought a civil war to secure her claim to the Castilian throne, personally leading troops and making strategic decisions that demonstrated her capacity for rulership. Ferdinand was equally capable, a skilled military commander, a shrewd diplomat, and an effective administrator. Together, they formed one of the most powerful and effective ruling partnerships in European history. At the time of Catherine's birth, Ferdinand and Isabella were deeply engaged in the final stages of their campaign to conquer Granada. The war had been ongoing for years, consuming enormous resources and requiring constant attention from the monarchs. And this meant that Catherine's early childhood was spent not in settled palaces, but in military camps and temporary quarters, following her parents' armies as they besieged Moorish fortresses and gradually tightened their grip on the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Catherine was the youngest of 5 surviving children, though Isabella had suffered miscarriages and infant deaths as well, a common tragedy in an era of high child mortality. Catherine's eldest sister, Isabella, had been born in 1470 and was about 15 years older than Catherine. This Isabella would eventually marry first Afonso, Crown Prince of Portugal, and after his untimely death, his cousin King Manuel I of Portugal, becoming Queen of Portugal twice over. Prince Juan, the long-awaited son and heir to both Castile and Aragon, had been born in 1478, making him about 7 years older than Catherine. From birth, Juan carried the enormous weight of dynastic expectations. He was groomed to inherit his parents' kingdoms, educated by the finest tutors, and trained in the arts of war and statecraft. Catherine would have looked up to her eldest brother with a mixture of affection and awe, understanding even as a small child that he was destined for greatness. Juana, born in 1479, was about 6 years Catherine's senior. Juana's story would prove to be one of the most tragic in Spanish royal history. Intelligent and strong-willed like her mother, Juana would eventually inherit Castile and Aragon, but she would also struggle with mental illness that earned her the cruel nickname Juana la Loca, Juana the Mad, and the relationship between Catherine and Juana, though separated by age and eventually by vast distances, would remain significant throughout their lives. Maria, the sister closest in age to Catherine, had been born in 1482, making her about 3 years older. Maria would also eventually marry King Manuel I of Portugal, becoming Queen of Portugal after the death of her sister Isabella. a complicated family arrangement that was typical of European royal marriages, where political alliances often trumped personal feelings. Growing up as the youngest child in this remarkable family, Catherine would have experienced both the privileges of royal birth and the relative freedom that came from being further from the succession. Unlike Juan, who was constantly watched and evaluated as the future king, or even her elder sisters, who were being prepared for their roles as Queen's consort, Catherine might have had slightly more liberty in her early years, though her life was still carefully regulated by the expectations of her rank. Catherine's physical appearance, as described by contemporary observers, was striking and memorable. She was petite in stature, inheriting her mother's smaller frame rather than her father's more substantial build. Her hair gleamed in shades of reddish gold, a colouring that suggested her English royal ancestry. Her great-grandmother had been Catherine of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt. This English connection meant that Catherine carried English royal blood through her maternal line, descended from Edward III of England. She would later remind people of this heritage when her position in England came under threat. Her eyes were wide and blue, described as intelligent and expressive, missing nothing of what occurred around her. Her face was round and youthful, with the fair complexion and pink cheeks that were considered marks of beauty in both Spanish and English court circles. As a child and young woman, Catherine was often described as beautiful, with one contemporary observer noting that she was the most beautiful creature in the world, and that there was nothing lacking in her that the most beautiful girl should have. But more important than physical beauty was Catherine's character, which was forming during these early years through observation and instruction. She watched her mother rule, not just as a consort, but as a queen regnant in her own right, making decisions about war and peace, justice and mercy, faith and governance. She saw her father negotiate with ambassadors, command armies, and manage the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized European politics. And she absorbed lessons about duty, faith, and the responsibilities of royalty that would shape her own approach to queenship decades later. The young Catherine's earliest memories would have been formed against an extraordinary backdrop. In 1486, when Catherine was less than a year old, her parents laid siege to the Moorish city of Loja. Though she would have been too young to remember this campaign, she was there, carried in the baggage train of the royal army. Throughout her early childhood, she would witness similar scenes: camps of soldiers, the sounds of siege engines and battle, the solemn religious ceremonies held to pray for victory, and the triumphant processions when cities surrendered. In 1487, when Catherine was not quite 2 years old, her parents besieged Malaga, a major Moorish port city on the Mediterranean coast. The siege lasted from May through August, and the royal family was present for much of it. Isabella famously declared that she would not leave until the city fell, setting up a luxurious tent city for the court near the siege lines. When Malaga finally surrendered in August, it was a major victory for Christian Spain, and young Catherine would have participated in the celebrations, even if she was too young to fully understand their significance. These early experiences of military campaigns had a profound impact on Catherine's developing sense of what it meant to be royal. She learned that queens did not merely wait passively in palaces for their husbands to return from war. Instead, they accompanied armies, organized logistics, rallied support, and shared in both the dangers and triumphs of military campaigns. Her mother, Queen Isabella, became her model for active, engaged queenship, a model Catherine would remember and emulate decades later when she served as regent of England during Henry VIII's French campaign. In 1491, when Catherine was 5 years old, she witnessed what would become one of the defining moments in Spanish history. After a prolonged siege, the city of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, agreed to surrender. The surrender was elaborately staged as a formal ceremony designed to emphasize the triumph of Christian Spain over Muslim Granada. On January 2nd, 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella, accompanied by their children and their victorious army, formally accepted the keys to the city. Catherine, dressed in fine garments appropriate to her rank, would have ridden alongside her family as they approached Granada's walls. She would have seen the Moorish king, Muhammad XII, known to Christians as Boabdil, ride out to surrender. She would have watched as Christian banners were raised over the Alhambra, that magnificent palace complex that represented centuries of Moorish civilization in Spain. She would have heard the great bells of the captured city ringing, calling Christians to prayer in spaces that had for centuries echoed with Muslim calls to worship. The completion of the Reconquista was not just a military victory. It was understood by Ferdinand, Isabella, and their contemporaries as a divine blessing, a sign that God favored Christian Spain. The propaganda surrounding the victory emphasized religious themes. This was presented as a holy war, a crusade to reclaim Christian lands from Muslim rule. The young Catherine, deeply religious even as a child, absorbed these lessons about faith, duty, and divine providence. Following the fall of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella did not immediately settle in the conquered city. They continued to travel throughout their kingdoms, a common practice for medieval and Renaissance monarchs who needed to show themselves to their subjects or administer justice personally and assert royal authority in regions that might otherwise feel neglected by distant rulers. The royal court moved from city to city, from castle to palace, throughout Castile and Aragon. Young Catherine travelled with her parents and siblings through the diverse landscapes of Spain, from the dry plains of Castile to the green mountains of the north, from the Mediterranean coast to the Atlantic shores. She saw cities and villages, castles and cathedrals, experienced the regional variations in language, cuisine, and custom that characterized the Spanish kingdoms. These travels gave her a practical education in geography, politics, and the realities of governance that supplemented her formal lessons. It was not until around 1499, when Catherine was about 13 years old, that the royal family established a more permanent residence at the Alhambra in Granada. This decision to make Granada a primary royal residence was both practical and symbolic. Practically, the Alhambra was one of the most magnificent palace complexes in Europe, with luxurious accommodations and beautiful gardens. Symbolically, establishing a Christian court in what had been the heart of Moorish power demonstrated the completeness of the Reconquista victory. The Alhambra, where Catherine spent her teenage years, was, and remains, one of the most beautiful architectural achievements in the world. Built by Moorish rulers over several centuries, the palace complex combined defensive fortifications with exquisite living spaces designed to be paradise on earth. The name Alhambra comes from the Arabic Al-Qala'a al-Hamra, meaning the Red Castle, referring to the reddish color of the walls. Walking through the Alhambra's courts and chambers, young Catherine would have experienced a world of geometric beauty and sensory delight. Water, precious in the dry climate of southern Spain, flowed everywhere in fountains, pools, and channels, creating cooling sounds and refreshing the air. The Court of the Lions, with its famous fountain supported by 12 marble lions, would have been a favorite gathering place. The intricate stucco work covering the walls demonstrated the sophisticated mathematical and artistic achievements of Moorish civilization. Geometric patterns, Arabic calligraphy, and floral motifs, creating a visual symphony that seemed to dissolve solid walls into lace, and light played through the space in carefully calculated ways. with windows and openings positioned to create specific effects at different times of day. In the Hall of the Ambassadors, light filtered through coloured glass, casting jewel-toned patterns on marble floors. In the Court of the Myrtles, the long rectangular pool perfectly reflected the fortress tower, doubling the architectural impact. Gardens filled with orange trees, pomegranates, roses, and jasmine provided both beauty and fragrance. For Catherine, living in the Alhambra during her formative teenage years meant inhabiting a space that embodied sophistication, learning, and beauty, but also conquest and Christian triumph over Islam. The juxtaposition must have been complex, admiring the beauty created by Muslim craftsmen while celebrating their defeat by Christian armies. And this complexity perhaps gave Catherine an early lesson in the ambiguities of power and the multiple perspectives that exist in any historical narrative. But the Alhambra was not just a beautiful residence. It also became a centre of learning under Ferdinand and Isabella. The Catholic monarchs understood the importance of education and attracted scholars, artists, and intellectuals to their court. It was during these years at the Alhambra that Catherine received the comprehensive education that would serve her so well throughout her life. Queen Isabella was determined that her daughters would receive educations far superior to her own. Isabella herself had received only basic religious instruction and minimal literacy training as a girl, a standard education for noblewomen of her generation, even those of royal birth. But Isabella recognized that this limited education had been a disadvantage when she came to power. She understood that knowledge was power, and she wanted her daughters to have every intellectual tool available. To achieve this goal, Isabella brought some of the finest scholars in Europe to the Spanish court to serve as tutors to her children. One of Catherine's primary instructors was Alessandro Geraldini, an Italian humanist scholar who was also a clerk in holy orders. Geraldini was well versed in the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome, fluent in Latin and Greek, and committed to the educational philosophy of Renaissance humanism. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts, the development of critical thinking skills, and the cultivation of eloquence in writing and speaking. Humanists believed that studying the wisdom of ancient civilizations, particularly classical Greece and Rome, could create better, more virtuous, more capable human beings. This was a revolutionary approach to education, moving away from the narrow scholasticism that had dominated medieval learning and embracing a broader, more diverse curriculum. Catherine also studied under the guidance of Peter Martyr d'Anghiera, known in English as Peter Martyr, another Italian humanist scholar who had come to Spain in 1487. Peter Martyr was not only a skilled educator, but also a historian and geographer who would later write important accounts of the Spanish exploration and conquest of the Americas. His presence at court meant that Catherine was educated by someone actively engaged with the great intellectual questions of the age. And under these distinguished tutors, Catherine studied an extraordinarily comprehensive curriculum that would have been unusual even for a male student of her era, and was almost unheard of for a woman. Let us explore the various subjects that filled young Catherine's days, shaping her into one of the most learned women of her generation. Latin was the cornerstone of Catherine's education, as it was for all serious students in Renaissance Europe. Latin was the language of the Catholic Church, of diplomacy, of scholarship, and of international communication. A person who could read and write Latin could access the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the works of Cicero and Seneca, the histories of Livy and Tacitus, the poetry of Virgil and Ovid, the theology of Augustine and Aquinas. Catherine learned not just to read Latin passively, but to write it elegantly and speak it fluently. She could compose letters in Latin, engage in theological discussions in Latin, and read complex philosophical and legal texts in Latin. This fluency would prove invaluable throughout her life, allowing her to communicate directly with papal legates, foreign ambassadors, and European scholars without needing interpreters. When she arrived in England and struggled to understand English, she could at least converse in Latin. Though, as we shall see, even this was complicated by different pronunciation traditions. Beyond Latin, Catherine also learned French, another crucial language for European diplomacy. French was widely spoken at courts throughout Europe and was considered the language of chivalry and courtly culture. And Catherine's French would allow her to converse with French ambassadors and navigate the complex diplomatic relationships between Spain, England, and France. Of course, Catherine spoke Spanish natively, or more precisely, she spoke Castilian Spanish, the dialect of Spanish spoken in central Spain. She also would have been familiar with other Iberian languages and dialects, given her travels throughout the Spanish kingdoms. Later, when she moved to England, she would add English to her linguistic repertoire, though she would always speak it with a Spanish accent. Mathematics and arithmetic formed another crucial part of Catherine's education. She learned basic arithmetic, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, but also more advanced mathematical concepts. This was not merely abstract knowledge. Understanding numbers was essential for anyone who would need to manage households, review accounts, or understand financial reports. As Queen, Catherine would need to oversee extensive household expenditures, review budgets, and ensure she was not being cheated by servants or merchants. Her mathematical training prepared her for these practical responsibilities. The study of civil and canon law gave Catherine a sophisticated understanding of legal principles, both secular and ecclesiastical. Civil law governed contracts, property rights, inheritance, and criminal matters. Canon law, the law of the Catholic Church, governed marriage, family relations, religious obligations, and church administration. Catherine's education in these subjects was unusually advanced for a woman of her time. She learned about legal procedures, so how to construct legal arguments and how to interpret complex legal texts. This legal education would prove crucial during the greatest crisis of her life. When Henry VIII sought to annul their marriage, Catherine was able to understand the complex legal and theological arguments involved. She could engage with church lawyers and theologians as an equal, pointing out flaws in their reasoning and constructing her own defense. Without her sophisticated legal education, she would have been at a severe disadvantage in these proceedings. Classical literature opened Catherine's mind to the great works of Greek and Roman civilization. She read, in Latin translation, as she did not learn Greek, the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, with their tales of heroes, warfare, divine intervention, and human fate. She read Virgil's Aeneid, which told of the founding of Rome, and was understood as a celebration of Roman imperial destiny. She read the philosophical dialogues of Cicero, learning about ethics, politics, and the art of rhetoric. These classical texts were not merely entertaining stories. They were understood as containing fundamental truths about human nature, proper governance, and the path to virtue. Renaissance humanists believed that by studying how the Greeks and Romans had lived, thought, and organized their societies, modern people could learn to create better societies themselves. Catherine absorbed these lessons, understanding herself as part of a long tradition of civilization extending back to classical antiquity. History was another major focus of Catherine's studies. She learned about the rise and fall of empires, the succession of kingdoms, the causes and consequences of wars, and the actions of great rulers. She studied Spanish history particularly, the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled Spain before the Muslim conquest, the centuries of Muslim rule, and the slow Christian reconquest. She learned about her own family's history, tracing the complex genealogies that connected Spanish royalty to kingdoms throughout Europe. Historical study was understood as providing practical lessons for rulers. By learning how past kings and queens had succeeded or failed, Catherine could apply those lessons to her own life. She would have studied queens who ruled wisely and those who fell from power, learning what strategies worked and what mistakes to avoid. Genealogy and heraldry might seem like obscure subjects, but they were crucial for someone of Catherine's rank. Genealogy, the study of family relationships and lines of descent, was essential for understanding the complex web of European royal intermarriage. Who was related to whom? Who had claims to which thrones? Who could potentially ally with whom through marriage? Catherine needed to understand these relationships to navigate the diplomatic landscape of Renaissance Europe. Heraldry, the system of symbols used to identify noble families and kingdoms, was equally important. Catherine learned to read coats of arms, understanding the symbolic language of colours, shapes and creatures that adorned shields, banners and seals. She learned her own heraldic symbols, the pomegranate of Granada combined with the castle of Castile and the lion of Leon. Later, when she married into the English royal family, she would need to understand English heraldry as well. Philosophy introduced Catherine to fundamental questions about the nature of reality, knowledge, ethics, and political organization. She would have studied the works of Aristotle, whose writings on ethics, politics, and metaphysics had been rediscovered and embraced by medieval Christian scholars. She would have learned about Plato's theory of ideal forms and his vision of the philosopher king. She would have studied Stoic philosophy, with its emphasis on self-control, acceptance of fate, and the importance of virtue, regardless of external circumstances. These philosophical studies gave Catherine intellectual frameworks for thinking about complex questions. When she faced adversity later in life, her philosophical training helped her maintain equanimity and dignity. The Stoic ideal of accepting with grace whatever fortune brings, while maintaining one's inner virtue, regardless of external circumstances, would become a guiding principle during her years of suffering. Religious studies and theology were perhaps the most important subjects in Catherine's education, given the central role of Catholic faith in Spanish society and in her own personal identity. She studied the Bible thoroughly, learning the stories of the Old and New Testaments, the teachings of Jesus, and the letters of the apostles. She learned church doctrine, the Trinity, the Incarnation, the sacraments, the communion of saints. She also studied the writings of the Church Fathers, early Christian theologians like Augustine of Hippo, Jerome, and Ambrose, who had shaped Christian thought in the centuries after Christ. She learned about the saints and their lives, understanding them as models of Christian virtue to be emulated. She learned about the structure of the church hierarchy, the role of the Pope as successor to St. Peter, and the relationship between church and state. This theological education was not merely academic. Catherine was deeply, genuinely pious. Her faith was the bedrock of her identity, giving meaning to her life and sustaining her through difficulties. The theological concepts she learned as a girl would inform every major decision she made as an adult. Her conviction that her marriage to Henry VIII was valid and indissoluble came not just from legal reasoning, but from her deep understanding of Catholic theology regarding the sacrament of marriage. Or beyond these intellectual pursuits, Catherine also received training in the arts. She learned music, becoming proficient in both singing and playing instruments. Renaissance education emphasized music as essential to a cultivated person. Music was understood as reflecting the divine harmony of creation, and the ability to make music was seen as elevating the soul. Catherine would have learned to play the lute, perhaps the virginals, an early keyboard instrument, and would have learned both sacred and secular songs. Dancing was another essential skill for someone of her rank. Court dances were elaborate, carefully choreographed performances that demonstrated grace, dignity, and social sophistication. Catherine learned the slow, stately dances appropriate for formal occasions, as well as livelier dances for celebrations. And dancing was not merely entertainment, it was a form of courtly display, a way of demonstrating one's nobility and refinement. Drawing and painting allowed Catherine to develop her artistic eye and manual dexterity. While she would not have been expected to become a professional artist, the ability to sketch and paint was considered a mark of cultivation. Renaissance nobles often kept personal books of hours, prayer books, that they illuminated themselves, combining religious devotion with artistic expression. Finally, Catherine received thorough training in the domestic arts considered essential for noblewomen. She learned to embroider, creating intricate needlework that decorated clothing, altar cloths, and household linens. She learned to spin thread and to weave fabric, and these were not merely practical skills, but also meditative activities. Many noblewomen found solace in needlework, using the repetitive motions as a form of prayer or contemplation. Catherine became quite skilled in embroidery, and throughout her life, she would create beautiful needlework pieces. During her most difficult years, when she was isolated and forbidden, many activities she would find comfort in her needlework, using it as a way to pass long hours and to create something beautiful despite her circumstances. This comprehensive education transformed Catherine from a pampered royal child into a formidable intellectual. By her teenage years, she could converse knowledgeably about philosophy, debate theological fine points, read classical literature in Latin, write elegant letters, manage complex accounts, and present herself with grace and dignity in any court setting. She was, by any standard, one of the most educated women in Europe, and better educated than many men of her time. But education alone does not make a queen. Character matters as well, and Catherine was developing a character shaped by her parents' examples and by the religious devotion that permeated her household. She learned duty, the understanding that royalty meant service to one's people and obedience to God's will. She learned dignity, the ability to maintain composure and grace regardless of circumstances. She learned strength, the capacity to endure difficulty without complaint. And she learned faith, the deep, unshakable conviction that God orders all things for the best, even when his purposes are mysterious. All of these qualities, the comprehensive education, the strength of character, the deep faith, were being developed during these peaceful years in Spain, preparing Catherine for the extraordinary challenges she would face in England. But even as Catherine studied and grew in the beautiful gardens of the Alhambra, her future was already being determined by forces beyond her control. Catherine's life had been oriented toward her marriage from the time she was 3 years old, in an age when royal children were valuable diplomatic assets. When alliances between kingdoms were sealed through matrimonial bonds, Catherine's future had been decided before she could possibly have any say in the matter. Her destiny was to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne, and through this marriage to cement an alliance between Spain and England. The negotiations for this marriage began in 1488, when Catherine was not yet 3 years old and Arthur was less than 2. The formal betrothal was sealed in the Treaty of Medina del Campo, signed on March the 27th, 1489. To understand why this marriage was so important to both Spain and England, we need to understand the political landscape of Western Europe in the late 15th century. The dominant political reality of the period was the rivalry between Spain and France for dominance in Italy. The Italian peninsula was divided into numerous independent states: the Kingdom of Naples in the south, the Papal States in the centre, and various republics, duchies, and principalities in the north, including Milan, Venice, Florence, and Genoa. These wealthy and sophisticated states were constant targets for the ambitions of larger powers, and control of Italian territory brought both prestige and economic benefits. France had dynastic claims to both Milan in the north and Naples in the south. French kings argued that these territories rightfully belonged to France, and they repeatedly invaded Italy to press these claims. Spain, particularly the Kingdom of Aragon, also had interests and claims in southern Italy, particularly regarding Naples and Sicily. Ferdinand of Aragon was determined to prevent French domination of Italy and to secure Spanish influence there. This meant that Spain and France were natural enemies, engaged in an ongoing rivalry that would shape European politics for decades. This also meant that Spain needed allies against France. England, lying across the English Channel from France, was a natural ally for Spain. If England and Spain could work together, France would be caught between two hostile powers, unable to commit its full strength to Italian adventures. For England's part, King Henry VII, who had claimed the throne by conquest in 1485, needed to establish the legitimacy of his new Tudor dynasty. Henry had a relatively weak claim to the throne by blood. He was descended from John of Gaunt through an illegitimate line that had later been legitimized. He had won the throne primarily through military victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where he had defeated and killed King Richard III. But victory in battle, while establishing practical possession of the throne, did not necessarily establish legitimacy in the eyes of European monarchs. An alliance with Spain, whose royal house, the Trastamara dynasty, was one of the most ancient and prestigious in Europe, would help validate the Tudor claim to the English throne. If the King and Queen of Spain were willing to marry their daughter to the Tudor prince, it suggested that they recognized the Tudor dynasty as legitimate. This recognition from established European royalty would make it harder for potential challengers to dispute Henry VII's right to rule England. Additionally, England, like Spain, saw France as a potential enemy. The 100 Years' War between England and France had only ended in 1453, and England had lost most of its French territories in that long conflict. English kings still claimed the throne of France and included the French royal arms in their own coat of arms. An alliance with Spain against France made strategic sense for England. So, on both sides, there were compelling reasons for this marriage alliance. The Treaty of Medina del Campo set forth the terms: Catherine would marry Arthur when both children reached marriageable age. Spain would provide a substantial dowry of 200,000 crowns, an enormous sum that reflected both Spain's wealth from its American conquests and the importance of this alliance. In return, England agreed to enter into a mutual defense pact with Spain against France. The treaty also contained clauses about what would happen in various contingencies. What if one of the children died before the marriage could take place? What if they married but had no children? These might seem like morbid concerns, but in an age of high child mortality and uncertain life expectancy, such provisions were essential. The treaty provided that if Arthur died before the marriage was consummated, Catherine could marry his younger brother Henry, preserving the alliance even in the face of tragedy. From age 3, then, Catherine knew that she would marry the Prince of Wales and become Queen of England. Her entire upbringing was oriented toward this future. She learned English customs insofar as they could be explained to her. She learned about English history and the complex dynamics of English politics. She exchanged letters in Latin with her future husband, formal epistles appropriate for two children who had never met but who would someday share a throne and a bed. While young Arthur, for his part, was receiving a similar education in England, preparing him for kingship and for marriage to a Spanish princess. Born on September 19th, 1486, Arthur had been given a name loaded with symbolic significance. King Arthur, the legendary ruler of Britain, represented an idealized past of noble kingship, chivalric virtue, and British greatness. By naming his son Arthur, Henry VII was claiming a connection to this legendary past, suggesting that the Tudor dynasty represented a restoration of ancient British glory. Prince Arthur was educated by some of England's finest scholars, including the poet Bernard André. He studied Latin, Greek, history, theology, music, and mathematics. Contemporary accounts describe him as an able student, and thoughtful and scholarly rather than athletically inclined. He was apparently of somewhat delicate health, though accounts differ on how sickly he actually was. He learned to dance, to fence, to hawk, and to hunt, all skills expected of a prince, though he seems to have preferred his books to outdoor pursuits. Throughout the 1490s, as Catherine was receiving her education in Spain and Arthur was receiving his in England, letters passed between them in Latin. These were formal letters, drafted with the help of tutors and secretaries, expressing appropriate sentiments for a betrothed couple who had never met. Arthur wrote of his eagerness to meet his future bride and to serve as her loving husband. Catherine replied with expressions of her devotion to duty and her hopes for their future happiness. These letters established a theoretical relationship between them, creating a sense of connection despite the vast distance and complete lack of personal acquaintance. As the 1490s progressed, preparations for the marriage intensified. Negotiations continued between Spanish and English diplomats over details of the dowry, Catherine's household, and the arrangements for her journey to England. There were delays and complications. At various points, either Spain or England would find reasons to postpone, as the diplomatic situation shifted and other considerations came into play. But by 1499, when Catherine was 13 and Arthur was 12, both sides were committed to proceeding with the marriage as soon as the children were old enough. In 1500, a formal proxy wedding took place. Catherine stood in a Spanish chapel and exchanged vows with an English envoy standing in Arthur's place, while in England, Arthur went through a similar ceremony with someone representing Catherine. These proxy marriages were a way of formally establishing the marriage contract even before the parties could physically come together. After the proxy wedding, Catherine was legally Princess of Wales, though she would not travel to England for another year. Finally, in the spring of 1501, when Catherine was 15 years old, the time came for her to make the journey to England. After nearly 13 years of preparation, after more than a decade of being told that her destiny lay in a distant northern kingdom, after years of exchanging letters with a husband she had never seen, as Catherine would finally travel to England to meet Arthur and to claim her place as Princess of Wales. The preparations for Catherine's departure must have been both exciting and frightening. She was leaving everything she had ever known, her family, her language, her homeland, the warm climate and brilliant light of Spain. She was traveling to a country she knew only from books and reports, where the weather was cold and grey, where the people spoke a language she had barely begun to learn, where customs and manners differed from those of Spain. And she was going to marry a boy she had never met, whose personality she knew only through formal letters that revealed little of his true character. But Catherine was a princess, trained from birth to fulfill her duty regardless of personal feelings. Her mother, Isabella, had taught her that royal women served their kingdoms through the marriages they made, that personal happiness was less important than political alliance, that duty to God and country superseded all other considerations. Catherine accepted these lessons, understanding that her marriage to Arthur was not primarily about her own happiness, but about strengthening Spain's position in Europe. The parting from her family must have been deeply emotional, though we have few detailed records of it. Isabella knew she would likely never see her youngest daughter again. Travel between Spain and England was difficult and dangerous, and Queen's consort were not free to make casual visits to their childhood homes. The two women embraced, each trying to memorize the other's face. Isabella gave her daughter final advice and maternal blessings. Ferdinand, less emotionally demonstrative but equally concerned for his daughter's welfare, gave her diplomatic instructions and reminded her that she would represent Spain at the English court. Catherine's siblings said their farewells. Her elder sisters, who had themselves been married to foreign princes, understood what Catherine was facing. Prince Juan, the heir to Spain, embraced his youngest sister, perhaps already feeling the illness that would kill him the following year. And young Maria, closest to Catherine in age, wept at the separation from her playmate and companion. Catherine was permitted to bring a small Spanish household with her to England. Ladies in waiting, servants, a confessor, and a few Spanish nobles to serve as advisors. This Spanish household would be Catherine's connection to her homeland, as people who spoke her language and understood her culture. Among them was Maria de Salinas, who would become Catherine's closest friend, and who would, 35 years later, be at Catherine's deathbed in defiance of a king's orders. The journey to England began with high hopes, but would quickly prove difficult. Catherine and her entourage travelled first to the northern Spanish coast, to the port of Corunna. Here, a fleet of ships awaited to carry the Spanish princess across the treacherous Bay of Biscay to England. On August 17, 1501, the fleet set sail, Spanish banners flying, carrying Catherine toward her destiny. But the Bay of Biscay, that stretch of Atlantic Ocean between northern Spain and western France, was notorious for its dangerous waters. Strong currents, unpredictable winds, and sudden storms made it one of the most treacherous passages in European waters. Catherine's fleet sailed into just such weather. Violent storms battered the ships, tossing them like toys in the enormous waves. The vessels, separated by the storm, struggled to stay afloat as wind and water threatened to overwhelm them. For Catherine, this must have been a terrifying introduction to sea travel. She had never been on a ship before, and now her first voyage was through one of the worst storms the sailors had experienced. She would have been violently seasick, thrown about in her cabin as the ship pitched and rolled, hearing the terrifying sounds of timbers groaning and sailors shouting desperately as they tried to save the ship. She must have wondered if she would die before even reaching England, to drown in the cold Atlantic waters far from home. The storm-damaged fleet was forced to land at Laredo, near Bilbao, having made it only a short distance along the Spanish coast. The ships needed repairs before they could safely continue, and Catherine and her household had to wait while carpenters worked to make the vessels seaworthy again. This delay caused considerable anxiety in England, where Arthur and his father were waiting for news of Catherine's arrival. When Henry VII heard about the first failed attempt, he took action to ensure Catherine's safe passage. He sent one of England's best sea captains, Stephen Butt, to Spain to help guide the Spanish fleet through the Bay of Biscay. With Butt's expertise, the fleet set sail again, this time managing to navigate the dangerous waters more successfully. Still, the voyage was long and uncomfortable. Catherine spent weeks on the ship, struggling with seasickness, eating preserved foods that were often spoiled or weevil-infested, living in cramped quarters that offered little privacy. The ship carrying a princess might have been more comfortable than a common vessel, but it was still a wooden box tossed by wind and wave, offering little protection from the elements. Finally, on October 2nd, 1501, Catherine's ship landed at Plymouth, a port on England's southern coast. After nearly 2 months since first setting sail from Corunna, Catherine had reached England at last. She must have felt an overwhelming mixture of relief at having survived the journey, anxiety about what awaited her, and perhaps some disappointment at her first view of her new home. England in October was cold, grey, and wet, nothing like the warm sunshine of Spain. The landscape looked barren and forbidding after the lush gardens of the Alhambra. Nevertheless, Catherine composed herself and prepared to meet the English people. She was dressed in Spanish fashion, which looked exotic to English eyes. Spanish women wore hooped farthingales, stiff skirts held out by wooden or whalebone hoops, creating a wide, conical silhouette that was quite different from English fashion. English women watched with fascination as this Spanish princess, dressed so strangely, nonetheless carried herself with unmistakable royal dignity. From Plymouth, Catherine and her entourage began the long journey toward London, where she would meet her future husband. The trip took a month, moving slowly through the English countryside, and this gave Catherine her first real impressions of England. The thatched cottages, the stone churches, the hedgerows and fields, the market towns. Everything looked foreign to her Spanish eyes. The architecture was different, the landscape was different, the clothes people wore were different, the food they ate was different, and she could barely understand a word anyone said. English people lined the roads to catch a glimpse of their future princess. They were curious about this Spanish girl who would someday be their queen. Some were hostile, suspicious of foreigners, and resentful of a Spanish marriage. But many were friendly, calling out greetings that Catherine could not understand, but whose tone seemed welcoming. She waved and smiled, giving them their first impression of her grace and dignity. On November 4th, 1501, and at Dogmersfield in Hampshire, Catherine finally met Prince Arthur face to face for the first time. This was the moment that both had been anticipating, and perhaps dreading, for years. They had exchanged letters, but they had never heard each other's voices, never seen each other's faces, never experienced each other's presence. Now, suddenly, they were standing before each other. These two 15-year-olds who were to be married and who would someday rule England together. Contemporary accounts do not provide detailed descriptions of this first meeting, but we can imagine the scene. Arthur, dressed in fine English fashion, trying to appear confident and princely despite his natural scholarly reserve. Catherine, in her exotic Spanish dress, and trying to appear poised despite her exhaustion from travel and her nervousness about this crucial first impression. Both aware that their families, their attendants, and numerous courtiers were watching and judging every gesture, every word, every expression. Arthur had prepared a formal greeting in Latin, the language they had agreed to use for communication. But when he began to speak, Catherine struggled to understand him. Arthur had learned Latin with an English pronunciation, while Catherine spoke Latin with a Spanish accent. The differences in vowel sounds and consonant pronunciation were significant enough that they had difficulty understanding each other, despite both being fluent in the language. This must have been frustrating and embarrassing for both of them, or highlighting the gulf that separated their experiences and backgrounds. Nevertheless, they managed to exchange formal greetings. Arthur expressed his joy at finally meeting his long-awaited bride. Catherine replied with appropriate expressions of honor and happiness. Both were on their best behavior, trying to make a good impression while navigating the awkwardness of this arranged first meeting. After this initial encounter, The formal party proceeded to London. 5 days later, on November 9th, Catherine entered London in a grand processional designed to present her to the English people. She rode through the streets on horseback, accompanied by her Spanish attendants and English nobles, while Londoners thronged the streets to see this exotic princess who would be their future queen. The city had been decorated for her arrival, and with banners hanging from windows, pageants and tableaux performed at various points along the route, and musicians playing from balconies. London in 1501 was a bustling medieval city of perhaps 50,000 people, crowded and noisy and smelling of human waste and coal smoke. It must have been overwhelming for Catherine, coming from the cleaner, more spacious environment of Spanish palaces. She was lodged at the Bishop of London's palace, while final preparations were made for the wedding. Here she had a few days to rest, to adjust to English food and English schedules, and to spend more time with Arthur. These days allowed them to become slightly more comfortable with each other, though they still struggled with communication. Catherine's English was minimal at this point, and their Latin remained mutually difficult to understand. The wedding ceremony was scheduled for November 14th, 1501, at St. Paul's Cathedral, the old Gothic cathedral that stood on the same site where Christopher Wren's Baroque masterpiece now stands, the original having been destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. This was to be a grand state wedding, celebrating not just the union of two young people, but the alliance of two kingdoms. The morning of November 14th, 1501, dawned cold and grey over London. Inside St. Paul's Cathedral, however, all was warmth and light and splendour. Hundreds of candles illuminated the great Gothic interior, their flames reflecting off gold plate and jewelled vessels arranged on the altar. The cathedral had been decorated with rich tapestries. The fragrant herbs had been strewn on the floors, and the best musicians in England had been assembled to provide appropriate music for this royal wedding. Catherine spent the early morning in her chambers, being dressed by her ladies-in-waiting. Her wedding gown was magnificent, made of white satin, a luxurious fabric that shimmered in the candlelight. White was a symbol of purity and innocence, appropriate for a virgin bride. The gown would have been decorated with gold embroidery, pearls, and precious gems, demonstrating Spain's wealth. Catherine's long reddish-gold hair was left loose, flowing down her back in accordance with the custom for virgin brides. A married woman would wear her hair covered, but an unmarried girl could display her hair. Her head was covered with a lace mantilla in the Spanish style, and she wore a coronet of gold set with precious stones. Around her neck hung jewels that had been gifts from her parents and from the English royal family. She must have looked beautiful, but also small and young and somewhat frightened. This 15-year-old girl preparing to walk into a cathedral full of strangers and marry a boy she barely knew. Meanwhile, Arthur was being dressed in his own chambers, in similarly magnificent clothing. He wore white satin as well, matching his bride, though his outfit included hose, doublet, and short cloak in the English fashion, rather than the Spanish styles Catherine wore. He too wore a coronet, emphasizing his status as Prince of Wales and heir to the English throne. Contemporary descriptions suggest that Arthur looked pale and nervous, the scholarly boy thrust into a very public ceremonial role. The ceremony was conducted with all the elaborate ritual of a royal Catholic wedding. Catherine was escorted to the cathedral by 10-year-old Prince Henry, Arthur's younger brother. This was a significant honour for the young prince, putting him at the centre of attention even at his older brother's wedding. Prince Henry was already showing signs of the charisma and physical presence that would later make him such a dominant figure. Even as a 10-year-old, he commanded attention, taller and more athletic than his elder brother, golden-haired and confident, where Arthur was dark-haired and scholarly. The escort duty also allowed young Henry to be seen in close association with this beautiful Spanish princess. Some historians have suggested that, even at age 10, Henry was developing an attraction to Catherine. Whether or not this is true, or the fact that Catherine and Henry were thrown together at this important moment, created a bond between them that would have profound consequences years later. Catherine walked slowly down the long nave of St. Paul's Cathedral toward the altar where Arthur and Archbishop Henry Dean of Canterbury awaited her. The cathedral was packed with nobles, courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and church officials, all dressed in their finest clothes, all straining to see the Spanish princess. Catherine had to maintain perfect composure under this intense scrutiny, walking with measured steps, her head held high despite the weight of her jeweled coronet and the enormity of the moment. When she reached the altar, Catherine stood beside Arthur, and Archbishop Dean began the lengthy wedding ceremony. The Mass was conducted entirely in Latin, as which at least Catherine could understand, though the English pronunciation remained challenging. The Archbishop blessed the couple, asking God's favour on their union. He inquired whether there were any impediments to the marriage, any legal or moral reasons why Arthur and Catherine should not be wed. None were offered, of course. This was not the sort of wedding where someone would leap up to object. Arthur and Catherine exchanged their vows, promising to love, honour, and obey until death should part them. Arthur slipped a ring onto Catherine's finger, a gold band symbolizing the eternal nature of their union, a circle with no beginning and no end. They knelt together to receive communion, sharing the bread and wine that Catholics believed became literally the body and blood of Christ. Then the Archbishop pronounced them husband and wife, ye Prince and Princess of Wales, future King and Queen of England. The ceremony was so lengthy that refreshments had to be served partway through. Contemporary accounts mention that both Arthur and Catherine had small shielded enclosures equipped with commodes nearby, acknowledging the practical reality that a ceremony lasting several hours required certain accommodations. These details might seem undignified to modern readers, but they were matter-of-fact to people of the time. After the ceremony concluded, the newlyweds processed back down the aisle, now married, while bells rang throughout London announcing the completion of the royal wedding. They emerged from the cathedral to find the city celebrating. There were pageants and performances, musicians playing in the streets, wine flowing freely, and people dancing. For a moment, all the anxieties of the age seemed to lift, replaced by general celebration of this union that promised peace and prosperity. The wedding feast that followed was magnificent beyond imagination. Held in Westminster Hall, that great medieval building that still stands today, the banquet featured dozens of courses. Roasted swans, peacocks served in their feathers, elaborate sugar sculptures, pies filled with exotic spices, fish from the sea and rivers, fruits from across Europe, and wine from France and Spain. The hall was decorated with tapestries depicting heroic scenes from classical mythology and biblical history. Musicians played throughout the meal. Acrobats and jugglers performed between courses. And Arthur and Catherine sat at the high table, eating little, trying to smile appropriately, while being stared at by hundreds of guests. And following the feast came more entertainment. A tournament where English knights demonstrated their skill at arms, competing in jousting and other martial games. These tournaments were not the deadly serious combat of earlier centuries, but rather had become somewhat theatrical, though still dangerous. Knights wore elaborate armour and carried lances, attempting to strike their opponents and knock them from their horses. The tournaments celebrated chivalric ideals of bravery, skill, and honour, all associated with the legendary King Arthur, after whom the prince was named. Finally, after this exhausting day of ceremony and celebration, came the most private and potentially most awkward moment: the bedding ceremony. This was a traditional ritual in which the bride and groom were escorted to their marriage bed by groups of nobles and attendants. The bride would be undressed by her ladies and put into bed. The groom would be undressed by his gentlemen and brought to join her. The bed would be blessed by a priest, and sometimes witnesses would remain in the room or just outside to confirm that the marriage was being consummated. This practice strikes modern people as bizarre and invasive, but in an era when royal marriages were matters of state importance, consummation needed to be verified. An unconsummated marriage could potentially be annulled, and the alliance it represented might be considered invalid. So the witnesses were there to confirm that the marriage had indeed been properly completed. What actually happened in the marriage bed between Arthur and Catherine that night would become the subject of intense scrutiny, bitter debate, and ultimately help determine the fate of England. More than 25 years later, when Henry VIII sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, the central question would be whether this marriage to Arthur had been consummated. Catherine would insist until her dying day that it had not been, that Arthur had been too weak or too ill, or perhaps too intimidated to consummate the marriage, that she had remained a virgin throughout her brief marriage to him. Others would claim that Arthur had boasted the next morning of being in the midst of Spain, suggesting successful consummation. The truth is unknowable. Arthur and Catherine are both long dead, and the witnesses who testified years later had their own political reasons for supporting one version or another. We cannot know what happened in that chamber at Westminster Palace on the night of November 14th, 1501. We can only know that this question, seemingly so simple, so binary, would eventually tear England apart. What we do know is that, after the wedding and its celebrations, Arthur and Catherine left London to take up residence at Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, on the Welsh border. Arthur, as Prince of Wales, had governmental responsibilities for Wales and the border regions, and Ludlow served as the administrative centre for the Council of Wales. This was not an immediate departure. They remained in London for about 2 weeks, attending more celebrations and allowing Catherine to be presented to various important nobles and officials. But in early December, the newly married couple set out for their new home. The journey from London to Ludlow took several days, travelling through the English countryside in winter. Catherine would have seen more of England: the rolling hills, the bare winter forests, the stone villages, the occasional castle or manor house. Everything must have seemed so foreign compared to Spain. The landscape was greener even in winter because of England's abundant rainfall, but it was also colder and greyer, without the brilliant light of the Spanish sun. Ludlow Castle, when they reached it, was an impressive medieval fortress. Built in the late 11th century, it sat on a hill above the River Thames, its massive stone walls and towers dominating the landscape. The castle had been extensively renovated in recent decades to make it more comfortable as a residence, not just a military fortification. Nevertheless, and it was still fundamentally a medieval castle, draughty, cold and damp, especially in the English winter. For Catherine, accustomed to the Alhambra with its sophisticated heating systems, running water and sunny courtyards, Ludlow must have seemed primitive and uncomfortable. The castle's thick stone walls kept out enemies, but also kept in cold and dampness. Fireplaces provided some heat, but they were inefficient, often filling rooms with smoke. Tapestries hanging on walls provided both decoration and insulation, but they could not entirely combat the penetrating chill of an English winter. Arthur and Catherine established their household at Ludlow, setting up the routines of daily life. They had separate chambers, as was customary for royal couples, coming together for meals, entertainments, and conjugal visits, but otherwise living largely separate lives. Catherine brought her Spanish attendants, who provided a touch of home in this foreign place. She had her Spanish confessor, who heard her confessions in her native language. She had her Spanish ladies-in-waiting, who dressed her in the Spanish fashion and spoke with her about memories of home. But Catherine also began to adapt to English life. She started seriously studying English, working to overcome the language barrier that made communication so difficult. She observed English customs and tried to understand English ways of thinking. She attended services at the castle chapel, where English prayers and hymns gradually became more familiar. She was trying, as she had been trained to do, to become English while remaining Spanish, to serve her new country while not forgetting her homeland. Arthur, for his part, seems to have been a considerate husband by the standards of the age. He did not mistreat Catherine or ignore her. They spent time together, took walks when weather permitted, attended entertainments together, and presumably grew more comfortable with each other as the weeks passed. Whether they developed genuine affection or remained merely cordial is unclear from historical records. Theirs was an arranged marriage, and expectations for love within such marriages were modest. Winter turned to spring, and still Arthur and Catherine lived quietly at Ludlow. They heard news from the wider world, letters from Spain, reports from the English court, information about European politics and military campaigns. But their daily life was relatively isolated and peaceful. They were young. They had decades ahead of them to learn how to rule together, to build their relationship, to have children. There seemed no particular urgency to their lives. But in March of 1502, that peaceful routine was shattered. A mysterious illness swept through Ludlow and the surrounding region, striking both members of the household and people in the nearby town. The disease manifested suddenly. Victims developed severe fevers, intense sweating, weakness, difficulty breathing, and terrible headaches. Some recovered within a few days, others grew steadily worse until they died. Contemporary accounts called it sweating sickness, or simply the sweat. The sweating sickness was one of the great medical mysteries of Tudor England. It appeared periodically in epidemic outbreaks, killed many of its victims with terrifying speed, and then disappeared as mysteriously as it had come. Modern medical historians have debated what this disease might have been. Perhaps a form of influenza, perhaps a hantavirus transmitted from rodents, perhaps something else entirely that has since disappeared from human populations. We will never know for certain. What we do know is that both Arthur and Catherine fell seriously ill. They developed the characteristic symptoms: high fever, drenching sweats, weakness. They were moved to separate chambers to prevent them from infecting each other further, though by this time both had already been exposed. Physicians attended them, but 15th century medicine had little to offer except bloodletting, herbal remedies of dubious effectiveness, war and prayer. The English court, learning of the prince's illness, was gripped by anxiety. Messengers rode frantically between Ludlow and London, carrying updates on Arthur's condition. Catherine was delirious with fever, drifting in and out of consciousness, probably unaware of the severity of her own illness. Her Spanish confessor and attendants prayed at her bedside, begging God to spare this young girl so far from home. Her ladies bathed her forehead with cool water, trying to bring down her fever. They changed her sweat-soaked bedding again and again, and gradually, slowly, Catherine's fever broke. After days of illness that must have seemed like an eternity, she began to recover. She was weak, exhausted, probably confused, but she was alive. Arthur was not so fortunate. His fever raged higher. His breathing became more laboured. His body, perhaps already weakened by years of a bookish indoor life, could not fight off the infection. On April 2nd, 1502, in his chambers at Ludlow Castle, Prince Arthur Tudor died. He was only 15 years old, not yet 16. He had been married for less than 5 months. He had barely begun his life. And now it was over. When Catherine was finally well enough to understand what had happened, to learn that her husband of 5 months was dead, she must have been overwhelmed by a complex mixture of grief, shock, and fear. She had barely known Arthur, but he had been her husband. They had shared a life together, however briefly. She had come to England to be his wife, and someday his queen. And now he was gone. What would happen to her now? Would she be sent back to Spain in disgrace? Would she remain in England, suspended in some uncertain limbo? The world she had known for 5 months had suddenly collapsed, leaving her adrift in a foreign country, having just recovered from a life-threatening illness herself. Arthur's body was prepared for burial according to the elaborate rituals of the time. He was embalmed, his internal organs removed and buried separately, a common practice for royalty, and his body placed in a lead-lined wooden coffin. The coffin was then carried in solemn procession to Worcester Cathedral, where Arthur was buried in a tomb near the high altar. Catherine, still weak from her own illness, did not attend the funeral. Royal widows typically did not attend their husbands' burials, and in any case, she was probably not strong enough to make the journey. News of Arthur's death reached King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York at Greenwich Palace on the night of April 4th. The king was awakened with the terrible news. He was devastated. Arthur had been his eldest son, his heir, the future of the Tudor dynasty. Now Henry's carefully laid plans for succession, for alliance with Spain, for establishing the Tudor dynasty firmly on the throne, all lay in ruins with this 15-year-old boy dead in a provincial castle. For Catherine, the months following Arthur's death were miserable and uncertain. She remained at Ludlow Castle initially, still recovering her strength, while English and Spanish diplomats debated her fate. She wrote pathetic letters to her father, Ferdinand, describing her situation. She had no money. The portions of her dowry that had been paid had disappeared into Henry VII's treasury, and she had no independent income. She could barely pay her servants or maintain her household. She felt abandoned and forgotten, a foreign widow with no clear purpose in England anymore. Eventually, Catherine was moved to London, but her situation did not much improve. She was lodged at Durham House on the Thames, given a small household, but provided inadequate funds to maintain herself and her Spanish attendants in appropriate dignity. Henry VII was willing to keep her in England, but reluctant to spend money on her, seeing her as a reminder of failed plans and wasted dowry payment. This began 7 years of suffering for Catherine, 7 years of poverty, uncertainty, and increasing desperation. And she was suspended between 2 worlds, no longer a Spanish princess living in Spain, not yet secure as an English princess with a definite future. She had servants who needed to be paid, but no money to pay them. She had debts accumulating in London, but no means to satisfy her creditors. She wrote repeatedly to both her father and to Henry VII, begging for financial assistance, for clarity about her future, for some resolution to her impossible situation. The core question was whether Catherine would marry Prince Henry, Arthur's younger brother, who was now heir to the English throne. If she did marry Henry, then the Spanish alliance would be preserved, and Catherine's position would be secure. But such a marriage faced significant obstacles. First, there was the canon law issue. Having married Arthur, Catherine was now Arthur's widow, and therefore technically Henry's sister-in-law. For her to marry Henry would be to marry her late husband's brother, which was considered incestuous by church law. However, as we have discussed, if Catherine's marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, then perhaps the impediment was less severe. Pope Julius II eventually granted a papal dispensation, declaring that Catherine and Henry could marry, based on the understanding that Catherine's first marriage had not been fully completed through consummation. This dispensation would later become the centre of enormous controversy, but for now, it seemed to clear the way. But even with papal approval, the marriage was delayed year after year. Young Prince Henry was only 11 years old when Arthur died, far too young to marry. But even as Henry grew older, reaching 13, 14, 15, his father did not allow the marriage to proceed. Henry VII had his reasons for delay. He was negotiating with Ferdinand about the dowry. How much had already been paid? How much was still owed? Should Catherine's own jewels and plate count toward the dowry, or were they her personal property? These financial negotiations dragged on interminably. Additionally, the political situation in Europe kept shifting. At times, England's alliance with Spain seemed crucial. At other times, when relations with France improved, or when circumstances suggested that an alliance with the Holy Roman Empire might be more valuable, the Spanish marriage seemed less important. Henry VII, a shrewd politician, and kept Catherine in reserve as a diplomatic option without committing to the marriage. For Catherine, these years were a trial of endurance. She lived in Durham House, which was comfortable enough, but not luxurious. Her household dwindled as Spanish attendants, seeing no future in England and receiving no pay, returned to Spain. Some of Catherine's ladies married Englishmen and left her service. Her chaplain and confessor remained, providing spiritual comfort even when material comfort was lacking. Maria de Salinas, her most faithful friend, stayed with her through all these difficulties, providing emotional support when everything else seemed hopeless. Catherine's letters from this period, written in Spanish to her father, are heartbreaking documents. She begged Ferdinand to intervene on her behalf and to pressure Henry VII to either allow the marriage to proceed or to send her home to Spain with her dowry returned. She described her poverty in pitiful detail, how her servants went unpaid, how she had to sell some of her plate and jewels to buy necessities, how she was falling deeper into debt. She wrote about her isolation, her loneliness, her desperation. But Ferdinand's responses were inconsistent and ultimately unhelpful. Sometimes he wrote sympathetically, promising to take action on her behalf. But he was engaged in his own diplomatic maneuvers and wars, and Catherine's situation in England was only one of many concerns competing for his attention. He needed the English alliance, which meant he could not press Henry VII too hard, lest the English king take offence and abandon the Spanish connection entirely. So Catherine remained in limbo, with neither England nor Spain willing to take decisive action to resolve her situation. During these difficult years, Catherine developed qualities that would serve her well in future crises. She learned resilience, the ability to endure suffering without being broken by it. She learned patience, understanding that situations which seemed intolerable might eventually resolve themselves if she could just hold on. She learned diplomacy, how to advocate for herself, how to build alliances among English nobles and court ladies who sympathized with her plight, how to maintain dignity even in poverty. And she learned faith, trusting that God had some purpose for her suffering, even if she could not see what it was. In 1507, Catherine's situation took an unusual turn. Her father, Ferdinand, formally appointed her as his ambassador to England. This made Catherine the first known female ambassador in European history, an extraordinary recognition of her abilities and her position. As ambassador, Catherine had diplomatic credentials and official status. She was given a cipher for encrypting sensitive correspondence with her father. She wrote letters to Ferdinand describing English politics, the personalities and inclinations of English nobles, and the state of negotiations between England and Spain. This ambassadorial role gave Catherine a sense of purpose and agency during her years of uncertainty. She was no longer simply a forgotten widow waiting passively for someone else to decide her fate. Instead, she was an active participant in international diplomacy, gathering information, advocating for Spanish interests, and maintaining communication between the Spanish and English courts. The role also improved her standing at the English court. She was now not just an impoverished widow, but an accredited ambassador, entitled to diplomatic respect. Catherine served in this ambassadorial capacity until a new Spanish ambassador, Gutierre Gómez de Fuensalida, arrived in 1508. Her service in this role demonstrated her intellectual capabilities and political sophistication to English observers. It also gave her valuable experience in the practical workings of diplomacy and statecraft, experience that would prove useful when she became queen and, especially, when she served as regent. Throughout these 7 years of limbo, one person's role would prove unexpectedly important. Prince Henry, or the boy who had escorted Catherine down the aisle at her wedding to Arthur, was growing into a young man. By 1508, Henry was 17 years old, tall, athletic, handsome, learned, and charismatic. He was everything his elder brother Arthur had not been: physically imposing where Arthur had been delicate, athletic where Arthur had been bookish, confident and charming where Arthur had been shy and scholarly. Contemporary accounts suggest that young Prince Henry felt attraction and sympathy toward Catherine. She was beautiful, educated, sophisticated, and exotic, a Spanish princess living in his father's court. She was only 6 years older than him, which seemed a significant gap when he was a child, but less so as he approached adulthood. And she was alone, abandoned, in need of protection, a situation that might appeal to a young man's chivalric fantasies. Whether Catherine returned these feelings is less clear. She seems to have maintained proper distance, understanding that any hint of romantic impropriety would damage her reputation and her chances of eventually marrying Henry. But she must have been aware of the young prince's interest, and she must have understood that her future depended on his willingness to marry her once he came to power. In 1508, plans were being made for Catherine to finally return to Spain. The marriage to Prince Henry seemed increasingly unlikely to occur. Catherine prepared herself emotionally for the return journey, for the admission that her years in England had ultimately been wasted, that she would return home as a poor widow rather than departing as the rich Princess of Wales she had been sent to become. But then, suddenly, everything changed. On April 21st, 1509, King Henry VII died. His son, now 17 years old, ascended the throne as King Henry VIII. Within days of his father's death, one of the new king's first actions was to announce his intention to marry Catherine of Aragon. The decision caught many by surprise. Why would Henry VIII immediately commit to this marriage that his father had been delaying for 7 years? Some accounts claim that it was Henry VII's dying wish, that on his deathbed, the old king had told his son to honor the commitment to Spain by marrying Catherine. And other historians believe that young Henry VIII was genuinely in love with Catherine, or at least infatuated with her, and that freed from his father's control, he immediately moved to claim her as his own. Whatever his reasons, Henry VIII was determined. The papal dispensation granted years earlier was still valid. There were no legal obstacles remaining. And Henry, now king, could do as he pleased. So on June 11th, 1509, just 7 weeks after Henry VII's death and 8 years after Catherine had arrived in England, Catherine of Aragon married Henry VIII in a private ceremony at the Church of the Observant Friars outside Greenwich Palace. After 7 years of poverty, uncertainty and abandonment, After years of being suspended between two worlds with no clear future, Catherine's situation was suddenly dramatically transformed. She was Queen of England. Catherine's private wedding to Henry VIII on June 11th, 1509, was deliberately simple and quiet. There were no grand public celebrations, no elaborate pageantry, no crowds of witnesses. The ceremony took place in the Church of the Observant Friars at Greenwich Palace, attended only by a small group of courtiers and officials. This simplicity was intentional. Henry wanted to marry Catherine quickly and quietly, before anyone could raise objections or complications. But if the wedding was private, the coronation would be magnificently public. Henry understood the power of spectacle, of using elaborate ceremony to demonstrate royal authority and to win the affection of his people. He wanted his coronation, and Catherine's, to be memorable, impressive, and joyous. So the coronation was scheduled for June 24th, Midsummer's Day, giving time for elaborate preparations. On the evening of June 23rd, the traditional eve of coronation, Catherine and Henry made a ceremonial procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. This procession was a carefully staged piece of political theatre, designed to present the new king and queen to their people, and to demonstrate the magnificence and power of the Tudor monarchy. Catherine, who had spent 7 years living in relative poverty and obscurity, now found herself at the centre of an extraordinary spectacle. She wore robes of crimson velvet trimmed with ermine, so heavy with gold embroidery and precious stones that they weighed upon her small frame. Till her long reddish-gold hair, symbol of her virginity, flowed loose down her back beneath a golden coronet set with rubies, sapphires, and pearls. She rode in an elaborate litter, a covered chair carried on poles by uniformed servants, upholstered in cloth of gold and decorated with the combined emblems of England and Spain. Henry rode separately on a magnificent white horse, dressed in robes that matched Catherine's. At 17, he was already imposing physically. Over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, athletic, with golden red hair and a handsome face. He waved to the crowds, smiled, projected confidence and vigour. This was not the scholarly, delicate Arthur, but a prince from a medieval romance, strong, handsome, charismatic. The streets of London had been cleaned and decorated for the occasion. Tapestries hung from windows. Flowers were strewn in the path of the royal procession. At various points along the route, elaborate pageants had been constructed, temporary stages where actors performed allegorical scenes celebrating the new reign. These pageants drew on classical mythology, biblical stories, and Arthurian legend, portraying Henry and Catherine as blessed by God and destined for greatness. The crowds that lined the streets were enormous and enthusiastic. Londoners, who had endured the miserly final years of Henry VII's reign, welcomed this young, energetic king and his beautiful Spanish queen. They called out blessings and good wishes. They threw flowers. They sang songs of celebration. Many wept with joy. The young king seemed to promise a golden age ahead, and Catherine, whose difficult years in England had won her much sympathy, and was now being rewarded with the crown she had waited so long to wear. Catherine must have been overwhelmed by the contrast between this glorious procession and the years she had spent in poverty and uncertainty. Just weeks ago, she had been an abandoned widow, in debt, considering returning to Spain in defeat. Now she was Queen of England, riding through London to the cheers of thousands, wearing jewels worth a fortune, about to be crowned in Westminster Abbey. It must have seemed like a dream. The procession wound its way through London's narrow streets, past the great houses of nobles, past shops and markets, past churches and guild halls. Musicians played at various points, adding to the festive atmosphere. The procession finally reached Westminster, and Catherine and Henry were lodged for the night in Westminster Palace, preparing for the next day's coronation. The morning of June 24th dawned bright and clear, an auspicious beginning to what everyone hoped would be a glorious reign. Catherine was awakened early by her ladies-in-waiting, who helped her dress in the elaborate robes she would wear for the coronation. These robes were even more magnificent than those she had worn the previous day. Multiple layers of silk, velvet, and cloth of gold, so stiff with embroidery that they could almost stand on their own. Catherine was escorted from Westminster Palace to Westminster Abbey, that great Gothic church where English kings and queens had been crowned for centuries. The abbey had been lavishly decorated for the occasion. Hundreds upon hundreds of candles illuminated the interior, their flames reflecting off gold plate and jeweled vessels. The finest tapestries from the royal collection hung on the walls. Fresh herbs and flowers covered the floor, releasing their fragrance as people walked upon them. Incense filled the air, the smoke rising toward the vaulted ceiling high above. The congregation filling the abbey represented the highest levels of English society. Nobles, bishops, judges, knights, ladies, all dressed in their finest clothes, all gathered to witness this historic moment. Foreign ambassadors were present as well, representing the kingdoms and principalities of Europe, evaluating England's new king and queen, assessing what this new reign might mean for the balance of power in Europe. The coronation ceremony itself was ancient and complex, drawing on traditions that stretched back centuries. Catherine and Henry processed together through the abbey, as walking slowly up the long nave toward the high altar. They were attended by bishops and nobles, by heralds and officers of state, each person playing a carefully prescribed role in this elaborate ritual. At the altar, Catherine and Henry knelt together. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Warham, conducted the service. He asked the congregation whether they would accept Henry as their rightful king and Catherine as their rightful queen. The congregation responded with a great shout of "Yay! Yay! Yay!" a formal expression of consent that legitimized the coronation. Then came the anointing. This was the most sacred moment of the coronation, when the monarchs were consecrated to God's service. Catherine and Henry removed their outer robes, wearing only simple white garments. The Archbishop anointed them with holy oil on their heads, their chests and hands, making the sign of the cross, dedicating them to the service of God and the English people. This anointing was understood to transform them spiritually, giving them a quasi-priestly character that set them apart from ordinary mortals. After the anointing, Catherine and Henry were clothed again in their coronation robes. Then came the investiture, the presentation of the symbols of royal authority. Henry received the royal swords, representing his duty to defend the realm and the church. He received the orb, a golden sphere topped with a cross, representing Christ's dominion over the world. He received the scepter, representing royal authority and justice. And finally, he received the crown, St. Edward's crown, that ancient golden crown set with precious stones, which had been used to crown English monarchs for centuries. But Catherine received her own regalia as well, a scepter and an orb, and then her crown. As the crown was placed on her head, the weight of it pressing down on her brow, Catherine must have reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. Born a Spanish infanta, widowed at 16, abandoned for 7 years, and now, at 23 years old, she was being crowned Queen of England in one of the most magnificent ceremonies Europe had to offer. The congregation in Westminster Abbey erupted in cheers as the crowns were placed. Outside, bells rang throughout London, announcing to the city and the realm that England had a new king and queen. Trumpets blared, the organ thundered, the choir sang the Te Deum, that ancient hymn of praise to God. After the coronation came communion, where Henry and Catherine received the consecrated bread and wine, affirming their Christian faith and their submission to God's will. Then they processed back through the abbey, now wearing their crowns, acknowledged as anointed monarchs by both church and people. The coronation was followed by a magnificent banquet in Westminster Hall. This great medieval hall, with its soaring hammer-beam roof, had been set with tables for hundreds of guests. The high table, where Henry and Catherine sat, was raised on a platform so that everyone could see the new king and queen. They sat beneath canopies of cloth of gold, wearing their crowns, while course after course of elaborate food was brought forth. The banquet featured dishes that demonstrated England's wealth and the reach of its trade. There were swans and peacocks, roasted and served in their plumage. There were elaborate sugar sculptures depicting castles, ships, and heraldic beasts. There were pies filled with exotic spices from the East. There were fish of every variety, meat of every kind, fruits imported from warmer climates, wine from France and Spain and Italy. Musicians played throughout the meal. Entertainers performed. Jugglers, acrobats, singers, dancers. Between courses, the King's champion rode into Westminster Hall on horseback, in full armour, challenging anyone who disputed Henry's right to the throne to come forward and fight. This was ancient ceremonial, theatre rather than genuine challenge, but it added to the spectacle. The champion rode the length of the hall, throwing down his gauntlet, and when no one accepted the challenge, he was rewarded with a golden cup, and the festivities continued for days. There were tournaments where knights competed in the jousting lists, wearing elaborate armour and carrying lances, attempting to unseat their opponents. Henry himself participated in these tournaments. Unlike his scholarly brother Arthur, Henry was an accomplished athlete who loved physical competition. He was an expert horseman, skilled with lance and sword, and he used the tournaments to demonstrate his prowess to his new subjects. There were dances in the evening, held in the great halls of Westminster Palace. Catherine had learned English dances now, and she moved through them with grace, her Spanish training evident in her poise and dignity. She danced with Henry, the two of them moving together in the elaborate patterns of courtly dance, their compatibility visible to all who watched, as these early months of Catherine and Henry's marriage were genuinely happy. Contemporary observers remarked on the evident affection between them. Henry was clearly delighted with his bride. He showed her off to ambassadors, boasting of her beauty and her learning. He consulted her on matters of state, valuing her political judgment. He included her in his daily routine, attending Mass with her, dining with her, spending his evenings in her company. For Catherine, after 7 years of suffering, this happiness must have seemed miraculous. She had gone from poverty to wealth, from abandonment to love, from uncertainty to security. She was Queen of England, married to a handsome young king who seemed to adore her, living in magnificent palaces, served by hundreds of attendants, honoured and respected. It was everything she had been promised when she left Spain 8 years earlier, and more than she had dared hope for during her years of widowhood. Catherine settled into her role as queen consort with capability and grace. She understood that queenship involved much more than wearing a crown and attending banquets. A queen had responsibilities, to produce heirs, certainly, but also to manage her household, to serve as the king's partner in governance, to represent the crown at ceremonial occasions, and to serve as an intercessor between the king and his people. Catherine proved remarkably skilled at all these aspects of queenship. She managed her extensive household with efficiency, overseeing hundreds of servants, ladies-in-waiting, and courtiers. She established routines for her day, rising early to attend Mass, breaking her fast, and receiving petitioners who sought her help with various matters, dining formally at midday, attending to correspondence and accounts in the afternoon, participating in court entertainments in the evening. Catherine was known for her charity work. She personally organized programs to help the poor, visiting hospitals and almshouses, providing money and supplies to those in need. She interceded with Henry on behalf of people who sought royal mercy, for criminals asking for pardons, for debtors seeking relief, for petitioners with various grievances. Her compassion and her willingness to advocate for the powerless won her widespread love among the common people of England. Catherine also served as an important diplomatic bridge between England and Spain. She maintained regular correspondence with her father, Ferdinand, was keeping him informed about English politics and advocating for the Spanish alliance. She entertained Spanish ambassadors, making them feel welcome at the English court. She promoted trade and cultural exchange between England and Spain. In all these ways, she fulfilled the original purpose of her marriage, strengthening the alliance between the two kingdoms. Intellectually, Catherine held her own in Henry's court, which was filled with some of the brightest minds in Europe. She conversed with scholars and humanists, discussing theology, philosophy, and classical literature. She became friends with Thomas More, that brilliant lawyer and author whose Utopia would become one of the most influential works of the Renaissance. She corresponded with Erasmus of Rotterdam, the greatest humanist scholar of the age, and who praised her learning and piety in his letters. Catherine commissioned works of scholarship and literature. Most notably, she asked Juan Luis Vives, a Spanish humanist scholar, to write a treatise on women's education. The resulting work, De Institutione Feminae Christianae, The Education of a Christian Woman, was published in 1523 and dedicated to Catherine. This treatise argued, controversially for its time, that women were intellectually equal to men and had the same right to education. Catherine's sponsorship of this work reflected her own belief in women's intellectual capabilities and her determination that women, including her daughter, should have access to comprehensive education. But beneath all these public successes and private happiness, there was one crucial area where Catherine would face disappointment and heartbreak: childbearing. As Queen, Catherine's most important duty was to provide Henry with heirs, preferably sons, to ensure the continuation of the Tudor dynasty. And it was in this crucial duty that Catherine would experience repeated, devastating failure. Catherine became pregnant quickly after her marriage to Henry. By the autumn of 1509, it was clear that the new queen was with child. The news was greeted with joy throughout England. The Tudor dynasty was new and insecure. Henry VII had claimed the throne by conquest just 24 years earlier, and Henry VIII was only the second Tudor king. A male heir would strengthen the dynasty immeasurably, giving England security and continuity. But in Tudor England, pregnancy was always dangerous. Medical understanding of pregnancy and childbirth was extremely limited. Doctors believed in the theory of the four humours, that health depended on maintaining the proper balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Their treatments were often useless or actively harmful, including bloodletting, purges, and various herbal concoctions of dubious value. Even the best physicians could do little to prevent miscarriage or stillbirth, and maternal mortality remained shockingly high. Catherine's first pregnancy ended in tragedy. In January of 1510, she miscarried a daughter. The baby was stillborn, never drawing breath, a tiny, lifeless form that represented the death of hopes and dreams, along with the death of a child. Catherine was devastated. She had failed in her most important duty. But Henry comforted her, telling her that they were young and had many years ahead of them, that this was just an unfortunate beginning, that surely the next pregnancy would be successful. Catherine recovered her strength and her spirits. She resumed her duties as queen, attending court functions, managing her household, continuing her charitable works. And soon enough, she was pregnant again. This second pregnancy seemed more promising. Catherine carried the child longer, experiencing the quickening, the first movements of the baby, which was taken as a sign that the child was healthy and would survive. On the 1st of January 1511, after a difficult labour, Catherine gave birth to a son. The baby was named Henry after his father and given the title Duke of Cornwall. The joy at court was unbounded. At last, England had a male heir. The Tudor succession was secure. Henry VIII was ecstatic, convinced that God had blessed his marriage and his reign. Catherine was triumphant, having finally fulfilled her most important duty. Lavish celebrations were organised. A magnificent tournament was held at Westminster, where Henry VIII himself participated, wearing armour decorated with an embroidered heart pierced by an arrow and the motto, Sir Loyal Heart. The tournament featured knights from across Europe, competing in jousts and other martial games. There were banquets, pageants, and distributions of money to the poor in celebration of the prince's birth. But the celebrations were premature and would turn to ashes. The infant Prince Henry, Duke of Cornwall, was a sickly baby. He struggled to breathe, struggled to feed. He grew weaker rather than stronger. The best physicians in England attended him, but they could do nothing to help. On February 22nd, 1511, just 52 days after his birth, Prince Henry died. The loss was crushing. Henry and Catherine had briefly tasted the joy of successful parenthood, had briefly felt the security of knowing they had an heir, and then it had all been snatched away. The baby's death must have seemed inexplicably cruel. Why would God grant them a son only to take him away almost immediately? What had they done to deserve such punishment? Contemporary sources describe Catherine's grief as profound. She was inconsolable for days, weeping constantly, withdrawing from court activities, spending long hours in prayer. She must have blamed herself, been wondering if she had done something wrong during her pregnancy or after the birth. Henry, too, was devastated, though as king he had to maintain public composure. The little prince was buried with appropriate ceremony, and the court went into mourning. But there was no time for extended grieving. Catherine was queen, and her duty was to try again, to provide Henry with the heir he needed. So Catherine composed herself, dried her tears, and resumed her life. And before long, she was pregnant once more. This third pregnancy occurred during the crisis of 1513, when Scotland invaded England while Henry was campaigning in France. Catherine, serving as regent, had to manage the defence of England while pregnant. The stress and physical demands of this crisis must have taken an enormous toll on her body. She was travelling as far as Buckingham, preparing to go even further north if necessary, organising armies, managing logistics, all while carrying a child. On October 8, 1513, shortly after news reached England of the crushing victory at Flodden, Catherine went into premature labour. She delivered a son, but the baby was born too early. He was tiny, underdeveloped, unable to survive outside the womb. He died shortly after birth, probably within hours. It was another devastating loss, made even more bitter by the timing. Catherine had successfully defended England, had achieved a magnificent military victory, but at the cost of another dead son. In 1514, Catherine became pregnant again. Again, hope rose that this pregnancy might result in a living child. But again, tragedy struck, and the pregnancy ended in either miscarriage or very premature birth. The historical records are unclear about the exact circumstances. What is clear is that no living child resulted from this fourth pregnancy. By this point, a terrible pattern was emerging. Catherine could conceive. She had no difficulty becoming pregnant. But she could not carry children successfully to term. Or if she did carry them to term, the babies died shortly after birth. Something was wrong, though no one in the 16th century could understand what. Modern medical historians have speculated about possible causes for Catherine's reproductive difficulties. Some have suggested Rh incompatibility, a condition where a mother's blood type is incompatible with her baby's, causing each successive pregnancy to be more difficult than the last. And others have proposed that Henry himself had a genetic condition, possibly MacLeod syndrome or Kell antigen incompatibility, that caused fetal death. Still others have suggested that Catherine may have had anatomical problems, perhaps a weakened cervix that caused premature labor. But in the early 16th century, none of these medical explanations were available. Instead, people looked for theological explanations. Repeated misfortune like this was understood as a sign of God's displeasure. But why would God be displeased with Henry and Catherine? They were pious, devoted Catholics. They attended Mass daily. They gave generously to the church. They ruled justly. What sin had they committed that deserved such punishment? These questions would fester and grow, thus eventually poisoning Henry's mind and contributing to his determination to end his marriage to Catherine. But that was still years in the future. For now, in 1514 and 1515, Henry and Catherine continued to try, continued to hope, continued to believe that eventually God would grant them a living son. In 1515, rumours spread that Catherine was pregnant again, but these reports were not confirmed until October. By this time, both Henry and Catherine had become cautious about announcing pregnancies too early, wary of celebrating prematurely only to face disappointment again. They waited until Catherine felt the quickening, until she was far enough along that they could reasonably hope this pregnancy might succeed. In January of 1516, a personal loss occurred that may have affected Catherine emotionally during this pregnancy. Her father, King Ferdinand of Aragon, died in Spain. Ferdinand had been a constant presence in Catherine's life, a source of support, however inconsistent, during her difficult years, and a connection to her Spanish homeland. His death meant that Catherine was now the daughter of a dead king, no longer able to appeal to her father for help or to rely on his influence in European politics. The news of Ferdinand's death was reportedly kept from Catherine for some time, out of fear that grief might cause her to miscarry. On February 18, 1516, Catherine gave birth to a daughter. The baby was healthy, strong, described as right lusty, vigorous and robust. She was christened Mary after Henry's sister, Mary Tudor. For the first time since her marriage, Catherine had successfully brought a child, not just to term, but into the world alive and apparently healthy. The birth of a daughter was not what England most needed. A son would have been preferable, but a healthy child was better than another dead infant. Henry tried to put a positive face on the situation, telling the Venetian ambassador, Sebastian Justinian, "We are both young. If it was a daughter this time, by the grace of God, the sons will follow." The message was clear. This was just a first step, proof that Catherine could bear living children, and surely sons would come next. Catherine devoted herself to her daughter with fierce maternal love. She ensured that Mary received the same comprehensive education that Catherine herself had received from Queen Isabella. Mary was taught Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, music, dancing, and embroidery. She studied theology, history, and classical literature. Catherine commissioned Juan Luis Vives to write a treatise specifically to guide Mary's education. ensuring that her daughter would grow up as intellectually sophisticated as any male heir might be. But while Catherine loved Mary deeply, she understood that England needed a male heir. The precedent of female rule in England was uncertain at best. England had never had a reigning queen. Women who inherited royal blood typically passed their claims to their husbands or sons, but they did not rule in their own right. The one attempt at female succession in English history had been the civil war during King Stephen's reign in the 12th century, when Stephen and the Empress Matilda had fought for 19 years over the throne, plunging England into chaos. The memory of that conflict, known as the Anarchy, made many English nobles deeply skeptical about female rule. So, despite Mary's birth, the pressure remained on Catherine to produce a son. And in 1518, Catherine became pregnant one final time. There was cautious hope that this pregnancy might finally produce the longed-for male heir. Catherine was 33 years old, not old by modern standards, but approaching the end of childbearing years by Tudor reckoning. This might be her last chance. But in November of 1518, Catherine gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The baby was born dead, never breathing, never crying, another tiny corpse to be baptized posthumously and buried. This seventh pregnancy, by the most conservative count, there may have been others that left no historical record, ended like most of the others, in grief and disappointment. After this final stillbirth, Catherine never conceived again. Whether this was because Henry stopped sharing her bed, or because Catherine had reached the natural end of her fertile years, or some combination of both, is unclear from the historical record. What is clear is that by 1524, Henry had stopped visiting Catherine's bedchamber. At 39 years old, Catherine was considered by Tudor standards to be past the age of childbearing. The toll of these repeated pregnancies, labours and losses was evident in Catherine's physical appearance. Contemporary descriptions from her youth had praised her beauty, her lovely hair, her fair complexion, her graceful figure. But by her mid-30s, after 9 or more pregnancies, Catherine looked much older than her years. Her hair had turned grey, her figure had thickened. Her face, though still dignified, showed the marks of years of suffering. Catherine coped with her losses through intensified religious devotion. She spent increasingly long hours in prayer, seeking to understand God's will and to accept whatever suffering He chose to send her. She became punctilious in her religious observances, fulfilling her obligations as a member of the Third Order of St. Francis with exact precision. She fasted regularly, wore the hair shirt of the Franciscans next to her skin as a form of penance, and devoted herself to charitable works as a way of serving God, even if she could not provide England with the heir it needed. But Catherine's inability to bear living sons would have profound consequences that neither she nor Henry could foresee in the early 1520s. The Tudor dynasty needed male heirs. Henry needed male heirs. And as the years passed, and it became clear that Catherine would bear no more children, Henry began to look elsewhere for solutions to his succession problem. The early 1520s saw Catherine and Henry's marriage enter a period of surface calm but underlying tension. They remained married. They appeared together at court functions. They maintained the forms of royal partnership. But the genuine warmth and affection of the early years had cooled. Henry had accepted that Catherine would not give him more children. He treated her with courtesy and respect, but the romantic element of their relationship was over, and Henry had taken mistresses before. Shortly after Mary's birth, he had begun an affair with Elizabeth Blount, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. Elizabeth, known as Bessie, was young, beautiful, and unlike Catherine, she proved fertile. In 1519, Bessie Blount gave birth to a son, whom Henry acknowledged as his own. The boy was named Henry Fitzroy, Fitzroy meaning son of the king, a designation used for acknowledged royal bastards. Henry had the boy ennobled as Duke of Richmond and Somerset, giving him a status second only to legitimate royalty. The birth of Henry Fitzroy proved that Henry was capable of fathering sons. The problem lay not with him, but with Catherine. This knowledge must have been bitter for Catherine to swallow. She had endured years of failed pregnancies, of grief and disappointment, as all while trying to give Henry a son. And now a common girl had succeeded where the Queen of England had failed. Nevertheless, Catherine maintained her dignity, treating the situation with the stoic endurance expected of queens. Royal mistresses were a fact of life, and a queen's duty was to ignore them with grace. But in 1525, a new woman entered Henry's life who would prove different from all his previous mistresses. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier who had worked his way into Henry's confidence. Anne had spent several years in France, serving in the household of Queen Claude, and she had returned to England in 1522 thoroughly Frenchified, sophisticated, stylish, accomplished in the latest fashions. Anne was not conventionally beautiful by the standards of her time, and she lacked the fair complexion, blonde hair and blue eyes that were considered ideal. Instead, she had dark hair, dark eyes, and an olive complexion that suggested Spanish or even Moorish ancestry. Later enemies would suggest she was descended from converted Jews. But she had something more compelling than conventional beauty. She had presence, wit, sophistication, and an ability to command attention when she entered a room. Anne became a lady-in-waiting in Catherine's household in 1525. At first, she seemed just another courtier, serving the Queen as dozens of young women did, hoping to make an advantageous marriage from among the noblemen who frequented court. But Henry noticed her. He was attracted by her continental sophistication, her sharp wit, her ability to banter and flirt without being crude. Unlike the modest English ladies who blushed and stammered in the king's presence, Anne treated Henry with playful irreverence that he found intriguing. Henry began pursuing Anne sometime in 1526. He wrote her love letters, passionate, ardent letters that still survive in the Vatican archives, providing embarrassing evidence of his infatuation. He sent her gifts, expensive jewels, fine fabrics, game from his hunts. He sought out her company at court functions, ignoring other ladies to focus his attention on her. He was behaving like a lovesick boy rather than a king in his mid-30s, and court observers noted his infatuation with amusement or concern, depending on their political loyalties. But Anne Boleyn did not respond to Henry's advances the way his previous paramours had. She did not fall gratefully into his bed, or honored to be chosen as the king's mistress. Instead, she refused him. She made clear that she would not become his mistress, would not give him her body without the security of marriage. Whether this was genuine moral principle, calculated ambition, or some combination of the two has been debated by historians. What is clear is that Anne understood that if she became Henry's mistress, she would be used and eventually discarded, like Bessie Blount and Henry's other casual affairs. But if she held out for marriage, if she made Henry believe that he could have her only as his wife, then she might become Queen of England. This refusal drove Henry wild with frustrated desire. He was the king. He was accustomed to getting what he wanted. Noble women considered it an honor to attract his attention. And yet here was Anne Boleyn, refusing him, yet keeping him at arm's length, always suggesting that if circumstances were different, if he were free, then perhaps, but not now, not while he was married to Catherine. It was in this context of sexual frustration and dynastic anxiety that Henry began to question the validity of his marriage to Catherine. On the surface, this might seem like cynical rationalization, a way to get rid of an aging wife who had failed to produce sons so that he could marry a younger woman who might. And certainly Henry's desire for Anne Boleyn was a crucial motivating factor in his decision to seek an annulment. But Henry also seems to have convinced himself that there were genuine theological grounds for questioning his marriage. The crucial text was Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21. If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. He hath uncovered his brother's nakedness, they shall be childless. Henry began to believe that this passage explained his marital difficulties. God had cursed his marriage because he had violated divine law by marrying his brother's widow. The death of his sons was divine punishment for this sin. The problem with Henry's interpretation was that it contradicted other biblical passages and ignored the papal dispensation that had specifically authorized his marriage to Catherine. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 and 6, commanded that a man marry his brother's widow if the brother died without children. This was the law of levirate marriage, designed to ensure continuation of the deceased brother's line. Catherine and her supporters pointed to this passage, arguing that Henry's marriage to her was not only permissible, but actually commanded by Scripture. Furthermore, Pope Julius II had granted a dispensation allowing Henry to marry Catherine despite her previous marriage to Arthur. This dispensation was based on the understanding that Catherine's first marriage had not been consummated, which removed the impediment of affinity, kinship by marriage. Henry's argument required claiming that the Pope had exceeded his authority, that the Pope could not dispense from divine law as expressed in Leviticus. This was a radical claim, challenging centuries of Catholic teaching about papal power. Nevertheless, Henry convinced himself that his interpretation was correct. He was encouraged in this belief by various scholars and theologians who told him what he wanted to hear, so either out of genuine conviction or out of desire to please their king. Henry began to genuinely believe that his marriage had been sinful from the beginning, that he had been living in sin for nearly 20 years, and that God's punishment was the death of his sons. In 1527, Henry decided to seek an annulment from Rome. He entrusted this delicate matter to Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, his chief minister and closest advisor. Wolsey was Archbishop of York, a papal legate, and one of the most powerful churchmen in England. He had served Henry faithfully for years, managing the administration of the kingdom, conducting diplomacy, accumulating wealth and power. If anyone could convince the Pope to grant Henry's annulment, it would be Wolsey. Wolsey began working on the annulment in secret and trying to arrange matters so that the case could be decided quickly and quietly in England before anyone realized what was happening. But this secrecy could not be maintained. Catherine learned of Henry's intentions, probably in the late spring or early summer of 1527, and she was horrified. Catherine refused to accept that her marriage was invalid. She insisted, as she had insisted since Arthur's death, that her first marriage had never been consummated, that she had come to Henry as a virgin, that therefore the passage from Leviticus about a man taking his brother's wife did not apply. She believed with absolute conviction that she was Henry's true wife and England's true queen, that any attempt to annul their marriage was not only unjust but sinful, and that it would endanger both her soul and Henry's. And Catherine also understood that her daughter Mary's legitimacy was at stake. If Henry's marriage to Catherine was declared invalid, then Mary would be illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne. Everything Catherine had worked for, everything she had endured, would be rendered meaningless if she accepted the annulment. So Catherine determined to fight, to defend her marriage and her daughter's rights with every resource at her disposal. Catherine had one enormous advantage in this fight. Her nephew was Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Charles controlled Spain, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, and the Holy Roman Empire, essentially modern Germany and Austria. He also, since May of 1527, effectively controlled the Pope. In May of 1527, our troops of the Holy Roman Emperor had sacked Rome in one of the most devastating attacks the city had ever endured. Pope Clement VII had taken refuge in the Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress connected to St. Peter's Basilica, where he was essentially a prisoner of imperial forces. Charles V now had enormous leverage over the Pope, and Charles was adamant that his aunt's marriage should not be annulled, partly out of family loyalty, partly because an annulment would suggest that Catherine had been living in sin for 20 years, which would dishonor both her and the Spanish royal family. As long as Charles controlled the Pope, Henry's annulment was effectively impossible. Pope Clement could not grant an annulment without alienating the emperor. But he also did not want to definitively refuse Henry and risk England breaking away from the Catholic Church. So Clement stalled, delayed, temporized, and hoped that somehow the situation would resolve itself. In June of 1529, an ecclesiastical court met in England to hear Henry's case for annulment. The court was presided over by Cardinal Lorenzo Campeggio, who had come from Rome as a papal legate, along with Cardinal Wolsey. The court met at Blackfriars in London. Both Henry and Catherine were summoned to appear. Catherine had spent the 2 years since learning of Henry's intentions preparing her defense. She had gathered documents, consulted with lawyers and theologians, and built a network of supporters at court and throughout England. She had also appealed directly to Pope Clement, or writing to him to plead her case and to beg him not to allow her marriage to be annulled. When Catherine appeared before the court at Blackfriars, she delivered one of the most famous speeches in English history. She knelt before Henry and spoke in English, which she had by now mastered, though her Spanish accent remained strong. "Sir, I beseech you for all the love that hath been between us, and for the love of God, let me have justice and right. Take of me some pity and compassion, for I am a poor woman and a stranger, born out of your dominion. I have here no assured friend, and much less indifferent counsel. I flee to you as to the head of justice within this realm." She then made her case. "This 20 years I have been your true wife, and by me ye have had divers children, as although it hath pleased God to call them from this world, which hath been no default in me. And when ye had me at the first, I take God to be my judge, I was a true maid, without touch of man. And whether this be true or no, I put it to your conscience." Catherine went on to challenge the court's jurisdiction over her case, arguing that she could not receive fair treatment in England, where all the judges were Henry's subjects and therefore could not be impartial. She demanded that the case be heard in Rome, where she might have a chance at justice. Having delivered her speech, Catherine rose, curtsied to Henry, and walked out of the courtroom. Officials tried to call her back. "Catherine, Queen of England, come into the court." But she ignored them. Her chamberlain, Griffith Richards, said, "Madam, you are called again." Catherine replied, on, it makes no matter, for it is no impartial court for me, therefore I will not tarry." She left the court and never returned. Catherine's speech and her dramatic walkout created enormous sympathy for her cause. Many English people, particularly common folk, saw her as the wronged party, a faithful wife being cast aside after 20 years of marriage, simply because the king had become infatuated with a younger woman. Anne Boleyn was widely unpopular, seen as a homewrecker and an upstart. When Anne appeared in public, people refused to cheer or doff their caps, maintaining a chilly silence that spoke volumes about their loyalty to Catherine. But public sympathy could not alter the political reality. Henry was king, and he was determined to have his annulment. When the Blackfriars court failed to reach a decision, Pope Clement recalled the case to Rome, preventing any judgment in England. Henry's frustration with Wolsey boiled over. The cardinal had promised to deliver the annulment, had assured Henry that it could be managed, and now he had failed. In October of 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his offices and arrested for treason. He died while travelling to London for trial. Some say from illness, others from the stress of his fall from power, and some whispered from poison. Whatever the cause, Wolsey was gone, and Henry needed a new strategy. That strategy would be provided by Thomas Cromwell, a former servant of Wolsey's who had managed to survive his master's fall. Cromwell suggested a radical solution. If the Pope would not grant Henry's annulment, then England should simply declare independence from papal authority. Henry could make himself supreme head of the Church in England, and then grant himself the annulment he desired. This was revolutionary. It meant breaking the unity of Western Christendom, which had been nominally united under papal authority for 1,000 years. It meant rejecting the Pope's spiritual authority over English Christians. It meant establishing a new understanding of kingship, where the monarch was not just secular ruler, but also religious leader. But Henry, desperate for his annulment and increasingly angry at papal obstruction, was willing to embrace this revolution. Between 1530 and 1533, a series of laws passed through the English Parliament, gradually reducing papal authority in England and increasing royal power over the Church. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, declared that England was an empire unto itself, subject to no foreign authority, including the Pope. This legal framework allowed Henry to proceed with his annulment without papal approval. In 1532, William Warham, the Archbishop of Canterbury, died. Henry appointed Thomas Cranmer as the new archbishop. Cranmer was a scholar and clergyman with Protestant sympathies, who believed that monarchs should have authority over their national churches. He was also personally sympathetic to Henry's desire for an annulment, believing that the king's marriage to Catherine had indeed violated biblical law. By late 1532, Anne Boleyn had finally given in to Henry's advances, convinced that he would indeed manage to marry her. She became pregnant in December of 1532 or January of 1533. Henry, desperate to ensure that any son born to Anne would be legitimate, married her in secret on January 25, 1533. The marriage was conducted by one of Henry's chaplains, without public announcement, while Henry was still technically married to Catherine. On May 23, 1533, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, sitting in judgment at a special church court at Dunstable, near to where Catherine was living, formally declared that Henry's marriage to Catherine had been invalid from the beginning. The marriage that had lasted 24 years, that had produced one surviving daughter, and that Catherine had defended with such determination, was declared null and void. Catherine of Aragon was no longer Queen of England. She was now merely Catherine, Dowager Princess of Wales, the widow of Prince Arthur. Catherine refused to accept this judgment. When officials came to inform her of Cranmer's decision and to demand that she acknowledge her new status, she refused. When letters arrived addressed to the Dowager Princess of Wales, she sent them back unopened, saying she knew no such person. When courtiers attempted to remove the royal cloth of estate, the canopy that hung over her seat, symbolizing her royal status, she protested vehemently. She continued to sign her correspondence, Catherine the Queen, and to insist that she was Henry's true wife. Henry's response was systematic persecution. He stripped Catherine of most of her servants, reducing her household to a skeleton staff. he forbade her from seeing their daughter Mary, who was living in a separate household. Mother and daughter, who had been extremely close, would never see each other again. He moved Catherine to increasingly isolated and uncomfortable residences, making her life as difficult as possible in hopes that she would accept her diminished status. But Catherine would not bend. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Many Londoners, loyal to Catherine, refused to celebrate. When Anne's coronation procession passed through the streets, people stood in stony silence, refusing to cheer or remove their caps. Anne, heavily pregnant, rode through hostile crowds who made clear their preference for the woman she had replaced. Catherine heard of Anne's coronation in whatever residence she was being kept at that time. The news must have been devastating, to know that another woman now sat in her place, wore her crown, slept in her bed, claimed her title. But Catherine maintained her dignity and her conviction. She was the true queen. Anne Boleyn was a usurper, and Catherine would not surrender her rights, no matter what Henry did to her. From 1531, when Catherine last saw Henry, until her death in 1536, Catherine was moved between various residences in increasingly remote and uncomfortable locations. These years of exile were characterized by isolation, deprivation of comforts, and separation from her daughter, but also by Catherine's steadfast refusal to accept the annulment or to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as queen. Catherine's first residence after being separated from Henry was the Moor, a castle in Hertfordshire that had once belonged to Cardinal Wolsey. It was a comfortable enough residence, though Catherine chafed at being separated from court and from Mary. She remained there only a few months before being moved to Hatfield Palace in May of 1532. At Hatfield, Catherine's situation worsened. Her household was reduced, with many of her long-time servants dismissed or forced to leave. Spanish attendants who had been with her for decades were sent away, leaving Catherine increasingly isolated from her countrymen. She was attended primarily by English servants chosen by Henry's officials, people who might report her activities and conversations back to the king. In September of 1532, Catherine was moved to Enfield. Then, in February of 1533, she was sent to Ampthill Castle in Bedfordshire. At Ampthill, Catherine's isolation increased further. The castle was remote, surrounded by forests, far from any major towns. Visitors were discouraged and closely monitored when they did arrive. Catherine's correspondence was read by officials before being sent, and many letters were confiscated if they contained anything Henry's government considered objectionable. It was while at Ampthill that Catherine learned of Cranmer's declaration annulling her marriage. Officials came to inform her that she was no longer queen and to demand that she accept her new title as Dowager Princess of Wales. As Catherine refused with vehemence, she declared that she was queen by law, by right, by sacrament, and that no earthly power, not Henry, not Cranmer, not even the Pope, could unmake her marriage. She insisted that she would call herself queen until she died, because that was what she was. Henry's officials tried various tactics to force Catherine's compliance. They threatened to reduce her household further if she did not submit. They suggested that her stubbornness was hurting Mary's position and prospects. They hinted that acceptance might lead to better treatment and perhaps even visits with her daughter. But Catherine would not be moved. She had decided that this was a matter of principle, of faith, of divine law, and she would not compromise. In July of 1533, Catherine was moved to Buckden Towers in Cambridgeshire. This was a medieval palace that had once belonged to the Bishop of Lincoln, but it was in poor repair, damp and uncomfortable. Catherine's rooms were cold and draughty, with inadequate heating even in winter. The location was even more remote than Ampthill had been, surrounded by the flat, marshy fenlands of eastern England, a landscape utterly different from the sunny hills of Spain, where Catherine had spent her girlhood. At Bucton, Catherine's health began to decline noticeably. The damp climate aggravated her ailments. She experienced increasing pain, possibly from the cancer that would eventually kill her. She had difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating, difficulty moving about. But she continued to maintain her routines, attending Mass in the chapel, spending hours in prayer, doing needlework, writing letters to supporters and to Rome, just insisting on her rights as queen. Henry's government, frustrated by Catherine's continued resistance, decided in April of 1534 to move her to an even more isolated location, Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire. Kimbolton was a moated manor house in a particularly unhealthy part of the Fens. The location was chosen deliberately. The damp, marshy environment was expected to further damage Catherine's health, and the isolation would prevent her from becoming a rallying point for resistance to Henry's religious changes. Catherine resisted this final move strenuously. When officials came to take her to Kimbolton, she barricaded herself in her rooms at Bucton, refusing to leave. She declared that they would have to drag her out by force and that she would resist every step of the way. The officials, unwilling to physically manhandle a woman whom many still considered queen, were stymied. Eventually, they resorted to subterfuge. They told Catherine's servants that she was being moved to better quarters near London, where she might see Mary. Some of her servants, believing this, persuaded Catherine to cooperate. Only when she arrived at Kimbolton did Catherine realize she had been deceived, and by then it was too late to resist further. Kimbolton Castle would be Catherine's final home. She arrived there in May of 1534 and would never leave, except as a corpse. The castle itself was a modest manor house, moated but not particularly grand. It had been built in the late medieval period and had passed through various hands before being acquired by the Wingfield family. In 1534, it was owned by Charles Wingfield, but he was forced to house Catherine at the king's command. Catherine was given rooms in the southwest corner of the castle. These rooms were cold, damp, and poorly furnished. She had been stripped of most of her possessions on Henry's orders, her jewels confiscated, her fine clothes taken away, even her gold and silver plate removed. She was left with the bare minimum necessary for survival. Her household had been reduced to just a few attendants, a handful of servants, a single Spanish lady-in-waiting, and her chaplain. Catherine was forbidden to attend services in the local parish church, probably because Henry feared she would use such public appearances to rally support among the common people, who remained largely loyal to her. Instead, she was confined to the castle, or attending Mass only in its small private chapel. She was permitted occasional visitors, but these were carefully monitored and controlled. Anyone who wished to see Catherine had to receive permission from Henry's government, and their conversations were reported back to officials in London. Despite these restrictions, Catherine managed to maintain some contact with the outside world. Letters were smuggled in and out of Kimbolton by sympathizers, servants, merchants, local people who remained loyal to the woman they considered their rightful queen. Through these clandestine communications, Catherine exchanged letters with her daughter Mary, forbidden contact, with Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador who served as her advocate at Henry's court, and with supporters throughout England and Europe, as Catherine also maintained correspondence with Rome, appealing to Pope Clement and later to his successor Pope Paul III to defend her rights. She provided information about Henry's break with Rome, the establishment of the Church of England, and the persecution of Catholics who refused to accept Henry as supreme head of the Church. Her letters were used by the Pope and by Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, in their diplomatic efforts to pressure Henry to restore Catherine to her rightful position. Daily life at Kimbolton was monotonous and difficult. Catherine rose early each morning and attended Mass in the chapel. She spent long hours in prayer and meditation, seeking strength from her faith to endure her trials. She did needlework, embroidering altar cloths, vestments for her chaplain, and other religious items. She wrote letters when paper and ink were available. She walked in the castle's small courtyard when weather permitted, getting what exercise she could, despite her deteriorating health. Catherine ate little, both because food was of poor quality and because she had adopted penitential fasting as part of her religious practice. She wore the hair shirt of a Franciscan tertiary under her clothes, a rough woolen garment that irritated the skin, worn as a form of penance and as a way to identify with Christ's suffering. She slept little, often rising in the night to pray. These austere practices, combined with the damp, unhealthy climate and her likely cancer, steadily undermined her health. Henry offered Catherine better treatment if she would simply acknowledge the annulment and accept the title of Dowager Princess of Wales. He also offered to allow Mary to visit her if both women would accept the new order, Catherine acknowledging that she was not queen and Mary acknowledging that she was illegitimate. But Catherine refused, and she counselled Mary to refuse as well. Catherine believed that accepting these titles would be lying, would be giving up their rightful positions, and would be accepting as valid Henry's break with the Catholic Church. Better to suffer than to compromise one's principles and imperil one's soul. The separation from Mary was perhaps the cruelest aspect of Catherine's exile. Mother and daughter had been exceptionally close. Catherine had personally overseen Mary's education, had spent time with her daughter daily, had guided her spiritual and intellectual development. Now they were kept apart, forbidden even to write to each other, and Catherine worried constantly about Mary, how she was being treated, whether she was maintaining her faith and her principles, whether she was in danger from Anne Boleyn or Henry's officials. In fact, Mary was being pressured intensely to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that she herself was illegitimate. She was subjected to psychological pressure, threats, and deliberate humiliation. She was stripped of her title as princess and forced to serve in the household of Anne Boleyn's daughter, Elizabeth, who was declared the true princess. Mary was forced to give up her fine clothes and jewels. She was told repeatedly that her defiance was causing her mother suffering, and that if she would only submit, both she and Catherine would be better treated. But Mary, inspired by her mother's example, refused to submit. She continued to insist that she was Princess Mary, legitimate daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine. She maintained secret correspondence with her mother, receiving encouragement and spiritual support. The bond between mother and daughter remained strong despite their physical separation. As 1535 wore on, Catherine's health deteriorated significantly. She experienced increasing pain in her abdomen, possibly from the cancer growing inside her. She had difficulty eating and keeping food down. She grew weaker, thinner, more frail. She spent more time in bed, less time moving about. It became clear to those around her that she was seriously, perhaps mortally, ill. News of Catherine's declining health reached Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis in London, and Chapuis had been Catherine's advocate at Henry's court for years, consistently arguing for her rights, reporting on her situation to Emperor Charles V, and maintaining communication with her despite government attempts to isolate her. He was deeply concerned about Catherine and determined to see her one last time. Chapuis requested permission from Henry's government to visit Catherine at Kimbolton. Initially, his request was denied. The government feared that such a visit would encourage Catherine's continued resistance. But Chapuis persisted, and eventually permission was granted, perhaps because officials believed Catherine was dying and a visit could do no harm at this late stage. Chapuis made the journey to Kimbolton, arriving on January 2nd, 1536. When he was admitted to Catherine's rooms, and he was shocked by what he found. The woman he saw was a shadow of the vigorous queen he had known years before. Catherine was 50 years old, but she looked much older. Grey-haired, painfully thin, weakened by illness and suffering. But her spirit remained unbroken. Despite her physical frailty, she greeted Chapuis warmly, eager for news from the wider world, and grateful to have a sympathetic visitor. For 4 consecutive afternoons, January 2nd through January 5th, Chapuis visited with Catherine for about 2 hours each day. They talked about many things: the political situation in Europe, Catherine's continued insistence on her rights as queen, her concerns for Mary's welfare and safety, her faith that God would ultimately vindicate her cause, even if she did not live to see it. Catherine spoke lucidly despite her illness, demonstrating that her mind remained sharp, even as her body failed. Catherine seems to have rallied somewhat during Chapuis' visit. She ate a bit more, moved about her rooms more easily, seemed to have more energy. When Chapuis left on January 6th, he believed she might be improving, that she might survive this illness and live for some time longer. He departed for London feeling somewhat hopeful about her prospects. But Chapuis' hope was misplaced. On the very day he left, January 6th, another visitor arrived at Kimbolton, one who had not sought or received permission, one who came in deliberate defiance of the king's orders. Maria de Salinas, Catherine's oldest and dearest friend, had learned that Catherine was dying. And Maria, who had been at Catherine's side since they travelled together from Spain 35 years before, was determined to be with her friend at the end, regardless of what the king or his officials might do to her for this act of disobedience. Maria de Salinas had married an English nobleman, William Willoughby, and was now Lady Willoughby. She had remained loyal to Catherine throughout all the years of exile and suffering, maintaining contact when possible, offering emotional and practical support however she could. Now, hearing that Catherine's death was near, Maria rode to Kimbolton, presented herself at the gates, and demanded to see the woman she still called Queen. Catherine's jailers tried to prevent Maria's entry. She had no permission from the king, and her visit violated the restrictions that had been placed on Catherine. But Maria was not to be deterred. Through a combination of determination, perhaps some bribery of guards, and sheer force of personality, Maria gained entrance to the castle and made her way to Catherine's chambers. When Catherine saw her old friend walk through the door, she must have felt overwhelming emotion. Gratitude that Maria had come, joy at seeing a familiar and beloved face, perhaps some premonition that this would be their final time together. The two women embraced, both weeping, both aware that 3.5 decades of shared experience, from the bright hope of Catherine's arrival in England as a 15-year-old bride to this dark ending in a cold castle in the Fens, were coming to an end. Maria stayed at Kimbolton, sitting with Catherine, praying with her, comforting her in her final hours. On the evening of January 6th, Catherine's condition worsened. The pain increased. Breathing became more difficult. It became clear that death was near. Catherine spent her final night in prayer, attended by Maria de Salinas, her chaplain, and a few faithful servants. She received the last rites of the Catholic Church: confession, absolution, and extreme unction, the anointing of the dying. She made her final confession, receiving God's forgiveness for whatever sins she had committed. She was anointed with holy oil on her forehead, hands and feet, her soul being prepared for its journey from this world to the next. In the early afternoon of January 7th, 1536, at approximately 2 o'clock, Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton Castle. She died as she had lived, with dignity, faith, and an unshakable conviction that she was Queen of England, whatever earthly powers might claim otherwise. She died in the arms of Maria de Salinas and her dearest friend, with her chaplain praying at her bedside. Contemporary accounts describe Catherine's death as peaceful. She did not rage against her fate or cry out in bitterness against those who had wronged her. Instead, she maintained the serenity that her deep faith had given her, confident that she was going to join God and that earthly suffering was ending. Her last words were prayers, commending her soul to God and asking for mercy for all, including those who had persecuted her. Before her death, Catherine had written a final letter to Henry VIII. This letter, one of the most poignant documents in English history, was found among her possessions after her death. In it, Catherine addressed Henry one last time as her most dear lord, king and husband, maintaining to the very end her insistence that she was his true wife. The letter read, "My most dear lord, king and husband, the hour of my death drawing on, the tender love I owe you forceth me, with my case being such, to commend myself to you, and to put you in remembrance, with a few words, of the health and safeguard of your soul, which you ought to prefer before all worldly matters, and before the care and tendering of your own body, for which you have cast me into many calamities, and yourself into many troubles. For my part, I pardon you everything, and I wish and devoutly pray God that he will pardon you also. For the rest, I commend unto you our daughter Mary, beseeching you to be a good father unto her, as I have heretofore desired. I entreat you also, on behalf of my maids, to give them marriage portions, which is not much, they being but 3. For all my other servants, I solicit the wages due them, and a year more, lest they be unprovided for. Lastly, I make this vow, that mine eyes desire you above all things, Catherine the Queen." Even in death, even after years of abandonment and persecution, Catherine forgave Henry and expressed her continued love for him. "Mine eyes desire you above all things," an extraordinary statement from a woman who had every reason to hate the man who had destroyed her life. But Catherine's faith taught forgiveness, and she genuinely believed that Henry had been led astray by evil counselors and by his own passions, and that ultimately God would bring him back to righteousness. 8 hours after Catherine's death, her body was examined in a secret autopsy, standard practice for royalty, to determine cause of death and to prepare the body for burial. The Spanish physician who performed the examination reported finding a black growth attached to Catherine's heart. This discovery immediately sparked rumours that Catherine had been poisoned, either by Boleyn, who would certainly benefit from Catherine's death, or by Henry himself or his agent. But modern medical analysis suggests that the black growth was not evidence of poisoning, but rather of cancer. The discoloration described is consistent with melanoma that had metastasized to the heart, or possibly with a rare form of primary cardiac cancer. The progressive abdominal pain Catherine experienced in her final months, her difficulty eating, her weight loss and general decline, all are consistent with advanced cancer rather than with poisoning. Nevertheless, the rumors of poisoning spread throughout Europe, in damaging Henry's reputation and Anne Boleyn's. Many people were all too ready to believe that Catherine had been murdered. She had died suddenly, though in fact her decline had been gradual over several months. She had been an obstacle to Henry and Anne's happiness, and her death came at a convenient time for them. Logic suggested murder, even if medical evidence pointed to natural causes. News of Catherine's death reached Henry's court at Greenwich Palace on January 8th. The king's reaction was complex and has been interpreted differently by different observers. According to the Spanish ambassador, Henry dressed in yellow, the Spanish colour of mourning, though some English chroniclers claimed this was not mourning but celebration. Henry allegedly told his courtiers that he was glad Catherine was dead, and as this removed a potential source of political instability and foreign intervention. He reportedly carried the infant Princess Elizabeth through the court, showing her off, celebrating that with Catherine dead, there could be no question about who was queen. Anne Boleyn's position seemed secure at last. But other accounts suggest that later that day, in private, both Henry and Anne wept when they thought about Catherine. Perhaps they felt guilt for the suffering they had caused her. Perhaps they genuinely grieved for a woman who had once been loved. Or perhaps they simply felt relief that a long, painful chapter had finally ended. Whatever their true feelings, Henry did not attend Catherine's funeral, and he forbade Mary from attending as well. Anne Boleyn's reported reaction to Catherine's death was to wear yellow and to say, "Now I am indeed a queen." But this apparent celebration would prove premature and short-lived. On the very day of Catherine's funeral, January 29, 1536, Anne miscarried a male fetus. This miscarriage would be the beginning of Anne's downfall. Henry had married Anne because she promised him sons. But like Catherine before her, Anne had struggled with pregnancy. She had successfully delivered Princess Elizabeth in September of 1533, but subsequent pregnancies had ended in miscarriage. This latest loss of a male child, which would have secured Anne's position, convinced Henry that his second marriage was as cursed as his first had been. Within months, Henry would turn against Anne, seeking to rid himself of her just as he had rid himself of Catherine. But Anne would not be given the option of exile. On May 2nd, 1536, less than 4 months after Catherine's death, Anne Boleyn was arrested on fabricated charges of adultery, incest, and treason. On May 19th, she was beheaded on Tower Green. Henry married his third wife, Jane Seymour, the very next day. The great love affair that had caused so much suffering to Catherine had ended in execution for Anne. Catherine's body remained at Kimbolton Castle for several weeks after her death. Her corpse was embalmed, her internal organs removed and buried separately, a standard practice for royalty, and placed in a lead-lined wooden coffin. The coffin rested in the castle's chapel, surrounded by candles according to Catholic custom, and servants maintained a vigil, praying for Catherine's soul. Finally, arrangements were made for Catherine's burial. She had requested in her will to be buried in a chapel of the Observant Friars, the religious order to which she had been devoted. But this was impossible. Henry had dissolved the monasteries and religious houses as part of his break with Rome, and the Observant Friars no longer had any establishments in England. Instead, Catherine was to be buried at Peterborough Abbey, now Peterborough Cathedral, about 40 miles from Kimbolton. The funeral procession from Kimbolton to Peterborough took place on January 29, 1536. Catherine's coffin was carried in a wagon draped in black cloth, followed by a small group of mourners. Despite the winter weather and the government's attempts to keep the funeral low-key, people lined the roads to pay their respects. Common folk who had loved Catherine as their queen stood in the cold to watch her coffin pass. Many weeping, many praying, many expressing anger at how she had been treated. The funeral service at Peterborough Abbey was conducted with honours appropriate to a Dowager Princess of Wales, not with the full honours due to a Queen of England. The coffin was carried into the abbey and placed before the high altar. Prayers were said, Mass was celebrated, and Catherine was buried in a tomb on the north side of the choir. The inscription on her tomb read simply, "Catherine, Princess Dowager, denying even in death the title she had insisted was rightfully hers. Henry did not attend the funeral, but Mary was forbidden to attend. The imperial ambassador attended as representative of Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew. A small number of Catherine's faithful servants were present, and Maria de Salinas was there, having defied the king to be with Catherine in her final hours, now defying custom and convenience to see her friend properly buried. Over the centuries that followed, Catherine's reputation would evolve. In the immediate aftermath of her death, she was remembered primarily as a tragic figure, a faithful wife, wronged by an unfaithful husband, a queen unjustly set aside. Catholic Europe viewed her as a martyr, a woman who had suffered for refusing to compromise her faith. Protestant England was more ambivalent, seeing her as an obstacle to necessary religious reform, but also sympathizing with her personal suffering. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, William Shakespeare wrote his play Henry VIII, which included a highly sympathetic portrayal of Catherine. Shakespeare's Catherine delivers a moving speech defending her honor and her marriage, a speech that closely follows the historical record of what Catherine said at the Blackfriars court. Shakespeare presented Catherine as a woman of dignity, virtue, and unshakable principle, a characterization that influenced how English audiences understood her for generations. In the 19th century, during the Victorian era, Catherine was often portrayed as the model of wifely devotion and feminine virtue, suffering nobly, forgiving endlessly, maintaining faith despite all trials. This Victorian interpretation emphasized Catherine's passive endurance rather than her active resistance, her gentle forbearance rather than her determined defiance. It was a sanitized version of Catherine that made her more palatable to 19th century sensibilities, but that also underestimated her strength and political acumen. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians have worked to recover a more complete and accurate picture of Catherine. Modern scholarship emphasizes her intelligence, her education, her political sophistication, and her agency. Rather than seeing her merely as a victim, modern historians recognize her as an active participant in the political struggles of her time. She built alliances, managed public relations, conducted diplomatic correspondence, and organized opposition to Henry's religious changes. She was not merely suffering nobly, but actively fighting for her rights and her daughter's rights. Old Catherine's daughter Mary eventually became Queen of England in 1553, following the brief reigns of Henry's son, Edward VI, by Jane Seymour, and the 9-day reign of Lady Jane Grey. As Queen Mary I, she attempted to reverse the English Reformation and restore Catholicism to England. Her efforts earned her the nickname Bloody Mary, due to the execution of Protestant heretics during her reign. But Mary's devotion to Catholicism was directly inherited from her mother, and her determination to be recognized as legitimate was rooted in Catherine's insistence that her marriage to Henry had been valid. In 1553, one of Mary's first acts as queen was to order that the inscription on Catherine's tomb be changed. Yet no longer would her mother be identified as merely Princess Dowager. The new inscription read, Catherine, Queen of England. Finally, 17 years after her death, Catherine was officially acknowledged with the title she had insisted was rightfully hers. Today, Catherine is remembered and honoured in various ways. At Peterborough Cathedral, an annual memorial service is held on January 7th, the anniversary of her death. The Spanish ambassador to the United Kingdom has attended these services, acknowledging the enduring connection between Spain and this princess who became England's queen. During the services, processions move to Catherine's tomb, where candles are lit, prayers are said, and offerings are placed, particularly pomegranates, Catherine's personal emblem. The pomegranate had been Catherine's symbol throughout her life. In representing both her Spanish heritage, the pomegranate was the emblem of Granada, and the qualities she embodied. The pomegranate symbolized fertility, but also royalty, righteousness, and abundance. After her death, the pomegranate became associated with Catherine's memory. Today, visitors to Peterborough Cathedral often leave pomegranates at her tomb, a gesture of respect for a woman whose story continues to move people nearly 5 centuries later. Catherine's presence can still be felt in the places where she lived. At Hampton Court Palace, where she spent happy years as Henry's queen, her heraldic symbols remain. The pomegranate can be found carved into doorways in the Great Hall. In the gardens, pomegranate trees still grow, their fruit ripening in late summer, or a living connection to the Spanish queen who walked these paths 500 years ago. At Kimbolton Castle, where Catherine spent her final years and died, her memory is preserved despite the many changes the building has undergone. The castle was extensively rebuilt in the early 18th century, transformed from a Tudor manor house into a grand Georgian mansion. It now serves as Kimbolton School, an independent secondary school. But the room where Catherine died is still there, now part of the headmaster's office. The chapel where her body lay before burial remains, though much altered, and some claim that Catherine's ghost still walks the corridors, a reminder of the suffering endured in this place. In Ampthill, Bedfordshire, where Catherine lived for several months during her exile, on her memory is commemorated by the Catherine Cross. Erected in 1776 on the site of Ampthill Castle, which has since been demolished, the cross honours Catherine with an inscription that acknowledges her as queen and notes the injustice of her treatment. Streets in Ampthill are named after her, and the town takes pride in its connection to this historical figure. Catherine of Aragon has been portrayed countless times in literature, film, and television. From historical novels by authors like John Plaidy, Philippa Gregory, and Alison Weir, to television series like The Tudors and The Spanish Princess, to the stage musical Six, Catherine's story continues to fascinate audiences. Each generation reinterprets her story through its own lens, finding in Catherine's life themes and questions that remain relevant, about women's rights, about power and principle, about faith and doubt, about love and betrayal. Modern feminist scholars have been particularly interested in Catherine, seeing in her an early example of a woman who refused to accept male authority when it contradicted her own understanding of justice and truth. Catherine lived in a profoundly patriarchal society where women were expected to be obedient, submissive, and accepting of male decisions. Yet she stood up to the most powerful man in England, refusing to bow to his will, insisting on her own rights and her own interpretation of law and scripture. She was eventually defeated. Henry got his annulment, his religious revolution, his new wife. But Catherine never surrendered, or never accepted Henry's version of events, never agreed that her marriage was invalid. This defiance came at enormous cost. Catherine spent her final years in poverty and isolation. She was separated from her daughter. She was stripped of her title and her dignity. She died in a cold castle, in an unhealthy climate, attended by only a handful of faithful servants. But she died as she had lived, with her principles intact, her faith unshaken, her conviction that she was right undiminished. Catherine's story raises profound questions about the relationship between power and principle. Should she have compromised? Should she have accepted the annulment, acknowledged herself as Dowager Princess of Wales, perhaps maintained a relationship with her daughter? Would it have been wiser to bend rather than break, or to accept the loss of title and position in order to retain some influence and comfort? Different people will answer these questions differently, Some admire Catherine's unyielding stance, seeing in it heroic integrity. Others think she was stubborn to the point of self-destruction, that a more flexible approach might have served her and Mary better. What cannot be disputed is that Catherine made her choice based on deep principle. She believed that her marriage to Henry was valid, that it was a sacrament ordained by God, that no human authority could dissolve it. To accept the annulment would have been, in her view, to lie, to sin, to imperil her immortal soul. And Catherine valued her soul more than her comfort, her principles more than her position. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, or let Catherine's story settle gently in your mind. Think of the Spanish princess who crossed stormy seas to marry a prince she had never met. Think of the young widow abandoned in a foreign land, enduring 7 years of poverty with dignity. Think of the queen who rode north to defend England, who organized armies, who won crushing victory while her husband campaigned abroad. Think of the mother who endured pregnancy after pregnancy, loss after loss, always hoping that the next child would live, that God would finally bless her with a son who would survive. Think of the woman who stood in a church court and defended her marriage with eloquence and passion. Think of the exile who refused to surrender her title, even when doing so would have eased her suffering. Think of the dying woman who forgave the husband who had caused her so much pain, who wrote that her eyes desired him above all things, even as she lay on her deathbed. Catherine of Aragon's life was filled with joy and sorrow, triumph and tragedy, love and betrayal. She knew the heights of power and the depths of abandonment. She experienced both the pleasure of being adored by a young king and the pain of being cast aside for a younger woman. She tasted victory on the battlefield and defeat in the birthing chamber. She knew luxury and poverty, health and illness, honor and humiliation. But through it all, Catherine maintained her dignity, her faith, and her conviction that she was Queen of England. She never surrendered that conviction, not to make her life easier, not to regain her husband's affection, not even to see her daughter one more time. She held fast to what she believed was true, regardless of cost. In the end, Catherine's legacy is not just her daughter Mary, who would briefly reign as Queen of England. Her legacy is not just her role in triggering the English Reformation, though that was historically consequential. Her legacy is the example she provides of a woman who knew her own mind, who understood her own worth, who refused to be diminished even by a king. Catherine of Aragon was born in the Archbishop's Palace in Alcalá de Henares, Spain, in 1485. She died at Kimbolton Castle in Cambridgeshire, England, in 1536. Between those two dates, she lived a life of extraordinary complexity. Sometimes tragic, sometimes triumphant, always memorable. She deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to Henry VIII's story, not as merely the first wife who was set aside, but as a remarkable woman in her own right, intelligent, educated, principled, and strong. As sleep claims you, dear listener, rest assured that Catherine too found her rest at last. After years of suffering, after a lifetime of duty and disappointment, Catherine died confident in her faith, secure in her conviction that she had done right, and trusting that God would judge her justly. May we all face our own final moments with such courage, such faith, and such dignity. Sleep well, and let Catherine's story remind you that true strength lies not in never falling, but in how we rise when we fall. Not in avoiding suffering, but in how we maintain our integrity despite suffering. Not in always winning, but in never surrendering what matters most. Good night, dear listener. May your dreams be gentle, may your sleep be deep, and may you wake tomorrow with renewed appreciation for the courage of those who came before us, who faced impossible choices and yet somehow found the strength to do what they believed was right. Thank you for joining us tonight on this journey through the remarkable life of Catherine of Aragon. If Catherine's story touched your heart, please let us know in the comments which moment moved you most. Was it her victory at Flodden, her defence at Blackfriars, her final letter to Henry, her friendship with Maria de Salinas, who defied a king to be at her side when she died? Please like this video to help others discover these gentle tales from history, and subscribe to Sleepy Crown to join our growing family of dreamers who find comfort and fascination in the quiet stories of the past. Until we meet again, sleep well, dear listener. May your dreams be as peaceful as Catherine's final rest, and may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow brings with even a fraction of her courage and grace. Good night from all of us at Sleepy Crown.